Before Moses ever stood before Pharaoh, before the Nile turned to blood, before the sea opened and an entire nation walked between walls of water, Egypt had already decided that men like him should never be allowed to grow up. His story did not begin with power. It began with a death sentence. Generations earlier, the family of Jacob had entered Egypt because famine had devastated the land of Canaan. Joseph, Jacob's son, had risen to extraordinary authority under an earlier pharaoh, and his position had helped preserve his family during the crisis. What began as the migration of one household gradually became the presence of an entire people. The descendants of Israel multiplied, they filled the land, and eventually Egypt changed. The book of Exodus introduces a new king who did not know Joseph. Whether this means he literally knew nothing about Joseph or simply refused to honor the relationship Egypt once had with Joseph's family, the result was the same. The Israelites were no longer viewed as protected guests. They were viewed as a threat. Pharaoh looked at their growing numbers and imagined a future crisis. If war came, he feared the Israelites might join Egypt's enemies' fight against the kingdom and escape from the land. Fear became policy. Policy became oppression. And oppression became an attempt at destruction. Egypt placed taskmasters over the Israelites and forced them into harsh labor. They built storage cities for Pharaoh, including Pithom and Ramses. Their lives were made bitter with hard service in mortar brick and agricultural labor. The intention was clear: weaken them, control them, break them. But Exodus emphasizes a strange reversal. The more Israel was oppressed, the more the people multiplied and spread. Pharaoh's solution was producing the opposite of what he wanted. The stronger the oppression became, the more deeply Egypt feared the people it was trying to control. So Pharaoh escalated. He summoned 2 Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and ordered them to kill the Hebrew male children at birth while allowing the girls to live. It was a calculated command. Pharaoh did not need to destroy Israel in a single day. If enough boys disappeared, an entire generation could be weakened, families could be broken, the future of the people could be controlled from the moment of birth. But the midwives feared God more than they feared the king. They did not obey Pharaoh's command. When questioned, they gave an explanation for why the Hebrew boys continued to survive, and Scripture records that God dealt well with the midwives. Once again, Pharaoh's attempt failed, and so the violence became public. No longer would the killing depend on secret instructions given to midwives. Pharaoh commanded his people that every Hebrew son who was born was to be thrown into the Nile. The river that sustained Egypt would now become an instrument of death. And into that world a child was born. His parents belonged to the tribe of Levi. Exodus later identifies them as Amram and Jochebed. They already had children, including Miriam and Aaron, but the birth of another son now placed the entire family in danger. For 3 months his mother hid him. The text does not describe those 3 months in detail, and we should not pretend to know every fear that passed through that household, but the circumstances are difficult to miss. Every cry could attract attention. Every neighbor could become a danger. Every passing official could bring the command of Pharaoh directly to their door. A newborn could not remain hidden forever. Eventually, Jochebed did something that at first sounds terrifying. She placed her son into the Nile. But not as Pharaoh had commanded. She made a small basket, coated it so that water could not enter, placed the child inside, and set it among the reeds along the riverbank. The Hebrew word used for this basket is especially striking because the same word is associated with Noah's Ark. In both stories, judgment surrounds the vulnerable. In both stories, water threatens death. And in both stories, an ark becomes an instrument through which life is preserved. Miriam, the child's sister, stood at a distance to see what would happen. Then someone approached the river. not a Hebrew slave, not another desperate mother. The daughter of Pharaoh. She had come down to bathe at the Nile while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent a servant to retrieve it. When she opened it, the child was crying. She recognized immediately that he was one of the Hebrew children. That detail matters. She was not confused about his identity. She knew he belonged to the people her father had condemned. And yet she had compassion on him. At precisely that moment, Miriam stepped forward. She asked whether she should find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. Pharaoh's daughter agreed. Miriam went and brought the child's own mother. The reversal is almost impossible to miss. Pharaoh had commanded that Hebrew sons be thrown into the Nile. Jochebed placed her son into the Nile in an ark. Pharaoh's own daughter discovered him. And now the palace of the man who had ordered his death would effectively pay the boy's own mother to care for him. Jochebed was told to take the child away and nurse him with wages provided for the work. For a time, Moses returned to the arms of the woman who had given birth to him. Eventually, when he had grown, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, explaining that she had drawn him out of the water. The child Pharaoh's decree was designed to eliminate had now entered Pharaoh's own household. That is one of the great ironies of Moses' early life. The future opponent of Egypt's king was raised within the world of Egypt's king. Scripture does not provide a detailed account of Moses' education inside the palace. Acts later describes him as being instructed in the wisdom of the Egyptians and powerful in words and deeds. But Exodus itself moves quickly from his adoption to his adulthood. We should therefore be careful about filling the silence with invented scenes. What we can say is that Moses grew up with an unusual identity. He belonged to Israel by birth. He belonged to Pharaoh's household by adoption. He had been saved from a decree directed against Hebrew boys. Yet he lived within the structure that had issued that decree. He stood between two worlds, and one day those worlds collided. Exodus tells us that after Moses had grown up, he went out to his own people and looked upon their burdens. That phrase is important. Despite his connection to Pharaoh's household, Moses recognized the enslaved Hebrews as his people. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. The text does not tell us how long Moses watched or what words were exchanged. It gives us something more direct. Moses looked this way and that. When he saw no one, he struck the Egyptian and killed him. Then he hid the body in the sand. This is not presented as the triumphant beginning of Moses' leadership. It is violent, it is impulsive, and it immediately creates consequences. Moses saw injustice, but his response did not free Israel. One Egyptian died. The system remained. The slaves were still slaves. Pharaoh was still Pharaoh, and Moses had now become vulnerable to the very power structure in which he had been raised. The next day, Moses went out again. This time he saw two Hebrews fighting with each other. He confronted the man who was in the wrong and asked why he was striking his fellow Hebrew. The response exposed Moses' position immediately. "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us?" Then came the question that changed everything. "Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses was afraid. The secret was no longer secret. The body had been hidden in sand, but the act itself had not disappeared. This moment reveals something that will return throughout Moses' life. He wanted to intervene. But the people he was trying to defend did not automatically recognize his authority. Long before Israel challenged Moses in the wilderness, a Hebrew man was already asking the question Moses would hear in different forms for decades. "Who made you our leader?" Moses had acted as though one violent intervention might address injustice. Instead, he discovered that Israel's suffering was larger than one taskmaster, larger than one confrontation, and larger than anything Moses could solve through his own strength. Word reached Pharaoh. The king sought to kill Moses. The adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter became a fugitive from Pharaoh. The man who had once escaped death as an infant now faced death again as an adult. So Moses fled Egypt. He left behind the palace. He left behind the enslaved people he had tried to defend. He left behind the river that had once carried him toward life. And he traveled east into the land of Midian. The contrast could hardly have been greater. Egypt was a kingdom of monumental architecture, centralized power temples, officials, military strength, and one of the ancient world's great river civilizations. Midian offered Moses something entirely different: distance, wilderness, and anonymity. There Moses sat beside a well. The man who would one day lead hundreds of thousands through a wilderness now arrived in the wilderness alone. The man who would one day speak before kings had no court. The man who had attempted to defend one Hebrew slave could no longer protect his own place in Egypt. At the well, 7 daughters of a priest of Midian came to draw water for their father's flock. Shepherds drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them. He watered their flock. It was a smaller act than what he had attempted in Egypt. There was no dead body, no royal decree, no revolution. Just a stranger defending people who were being mistreated. When the women returned home earlier than expected, their father asked why. They explained that an Egyptian had rescued them from the shepherds and had even drawn water for the flock. Their description of Moses as an Egyptian shows how he appeared to the world around him. Whatever Moses knew about his Hebrew identity, others could still look at him and see Egypt. Their father invited Moses into the household. This man is identified in Exodus by the name Reuel, while other passages refer to Moses' father-in-law as Jethro. The biblical text uses these names in ways that have produced discussion among readers, but for the purpose of Moses' story, the central point is clear. Moses became connected to a Midianite household and eventually married Zipporah. She gave birth to a son. Moses named him Gershom, saying that he had become a foreigner in a foreign land. The name captured the reality of his life. He had belonged to a people enslaved in Egypt. He had grown up in the household of their oppressor. He had tried to act on behalf of his people. His attempt had failed. Now he lived far away, building a family in a land that was not Egypt and not Canaan. From Moses' perspective, it may have seemed that his Egyptian chapter had closed. But Exodus shifts the camera, so to speak, back toward Egypt. The king of Egypt died. Yet the suffering of Israel did not end with him. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Their cry rose to God. Then Scripture reaches backward into promises made centuries earlier. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This does not mean God had forgotten and suddenly recovered a lost memory. In biblical language, God remembering his covenant points toward his acting in faithfulness to what he had promised. He saw the people of Israel. He knew. Those final words changed the direction of the entire story. Moses had escaped Egypt. God had not abandoned Israel. Moses may have believed he was finished with Pharaoh, finished with slavery, finished with the conflict that had turned him into a fugitive, but Israel was still crying out. The covenant still stood, and the man who had once looked at his own weakness, his own failure, and his own exile was about to encounter a calling larger than anything he had attempted in his own strength. Years would pass in Midian. The former resident of Pharaoh's world would become a shepherd. The would-be deliverer would learn the quiet rhythms of another life. And somewhere beyond the desert, Israel would continue making bricks for Egypt. Moses had left the crisis behind, or so it appeared. because one day, while leading a flock beyond the wilderness, he would see a fire that should have consumed everything it touched. But the bush would not burn away. And from that fire would come the command that would force Moses to face the kingdom he had fled, the people who had rejected him, and the question that would define the rest of his life. Would a fugitive return to Egypt when God told him to go? Moses did not return to Egypt because he suddenly recovered confidence in himself. He returned because God interrupted the life he had built in Midian. By then, Moses was no longer the man who had acted impulsively in Egypt. The palace was behind him. The killing of the Egyptian belonged to another chapter. The people he once tried to defend were far away, still laboring under a system he had been powerless to change. Moses had become a shepherd. There is a quiet irony in that transformation. The man who had once lived near the center of Egyptian power now spent his days leading animals across open country. The man who had once tried to solve injustice with one violent act now lived far from courts, armies, overseers, and royal authority. And then, in the wilderness, everything changed. Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro when he led the animals beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, later identified with the mountain of God. There he saw something that demanded his attention. A bush was burning, yet it was not being consumed. Fire normally destroys what it touches. Branches blacken, leaves disappear, wood collapses into ash. But this fire continued. The bush remained. Moses turned aside to investigate. Then God called to him from the bush. "Moses, Moses?" The fugitive shepherd answered, "Here I am." He was told not to come closer and to remove his sandals because the place where he stood was holy ground. Then the voice identified itself. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. The story of Moses was being pulled back into a promise that began long before he was born. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And then came the reason for the encounter. God declared that he had seen the affliction of his people in Egypt, heard their cries because of their taskmasters, and knew their suffering. He had come down to deliver them. This was the answer Israel had been waiting for. But the answer contained something Moses did not expect. God would send him. "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." The sentence joined together everything Moses had tried to leave behind. Pharaoh, Israel, Israel, Egypt, deliverance. Moses had once attempted to intervene on behalf of one Hebrew slave, and the result had been murder, exposure, rejection, and exile. Now he was being commanded to return and confront the ruler of the entire system. His response was not immediate courage. It was a question. Who am I? It is difficult to miss how different Moses now sounded from the younger man who had struck down the Egyptian. Then he had acted. Now he hesitated. Perhaps years in Midian had changed him. Perhaps failure had taught him the limits of his own strength. Scripture does not give us a psychological biography of those years, so we should be cautious about claiming exactly what Moses felt. What it does show clearly is that Moses did not consider himself an obvious choice. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? God's answer did not focus on building Moses' self-esteem. He did not list Moses' qualifications. He said, in essence, that Moses would not go alone. "I will be with you." That would become the foundation of Moses' mission. Not his royal upbringing, not his knowledge of Egypt, not his natural ability. The decisive fact would be the presence of God. A sign was also promised after Moses brought the people out of Egypt. They would worship God at this mountain. Notice the order. Moses had not yet returned to Egypt. Pharaoh had not been confronted. No plague had fallen. No Israelite had crossed a sea. Yet the promise pointed beyond all of those obstacles to a future moment when the people would stand free at the mountain. But Moses had another question. If he went to the Israelites and told them that the God of their fathers had sent him, they might ask for his name. What shall I say to them? The response is one of the most significant revelations in the Exodus narrative. God said to Moses, "I am who I am." He instructed Moses to tell Israel, "I am has sent me to you." The divine name revealed in this passage is associated with the Hebrew name often represented by the 4 letters YHWH. English Bible translations handle the name in different ways, frequently rendering it as the Lord in capital letters. The point of the scene is not that Moses received a magical password. The name revealed the identity of the one sending him. The God calling Moses was not a local deity invented for a political uprising. He was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God connected to the covenant promises Israel had carried for generations. Moses was instructed to gather Israel's elders and announce that God had seen what Egypt had done to them. He was to tell them that God would bring them out of the affliction of Egypt and lead them toward the land associated with the Canaanites and other peoples of the region, a land described as flowing with milk and honey. Then Moses and the elders were to go before the king of Egypt. They would ask to journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord. But God also told Moses something important before the confrontation even began. The king of Egypt would not simply let them go. Resistance was expected. The mission would not succeed because Moses presented a persuasive argument and Pharaoh reconsidered his policies. Egypt would have to experience the power of God. Only afterward would Pharaoh release the people. Even before Moses left Midian, the central conflict was already defined. But Moses still was not ready. What if they do not believe me or listen to me? His fear was understandable in light of his history. The last time Exodus recorded a Hebrew speaking directly to Moses in Egypt, the man had challenged him. "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us?" Moses knew firsthand that shared ancestry did not guarantee trust. So God gave him signs. Moses was told to throw his staff on the ground. It became a serpent. Moses fled from it. Then he was told to reach down and take it by the tail. When he did, it became a staff again. Next, Moses was told to place his hand inside his cloak. When he removed it, the hand was diseased in appearance. When he put it back and withdrew it again, it was restored. And if these signs were not enough, Moses was told that water taken from the Nile could be poured onto dry ground and become blood. Each sign pointed beyond Moses. His authority would not depend merely on convincing speeches. But Moses had another objection. He was not eloquent. He described himself as slow of speech and tongue. Interpretations vary regarding exactly what Moses meant. Some readers have understood this as a speech impediment. Others see it as a broader claim that Moses did not consider himself a skilled speaker. The text does not require us to diagnose him. The important point is that Moses saw his speech as a reason he was unqualified. God answered by reminding Moses who created the human mouth. The one sending him was able to teach him what to say. Still, Moses resisted. Finally, the reluctance became almost a refusal. "Please send someone else." At this point, the text says that the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. God had answered objection after objection. "Who am I will be with you. What name shall I give? Tell them who I am. What if they do not believe me? Here are signs. I cannot speak well. I will teach you what to say." And still Moses wanted someone else to go, so Aaron, Moses' brother, entered the mission more directly. God told Moses that Aaron could speak well and would meet him. Moses would give him the words, and Aaron would speak to the people. The arrangement did not remove Moses from responsibility. Aaron would assist him, but Moses still had to return. The shepherd could no longer remain at Horeb, pretending Egypt belonged only to his past. The call had become a command. Moses went back to Jethro and asked permission to return to his people in Egypt to see whether they were still alive. Jethro told him to go in peace. God also assured Moses that those who had sought his life were dead. So Moses took his wife and sons and began the journey toward Egypt, carrying the staff that would become associated with the signs God had given him. The return journey includes one of the most difficult and unusual passages in Exodus. At a lodging place, the text says, "The Lord confronted Moses and sought to put him to death." Zipporah circumcised their son and touched Moses' feet with the foreskin, after which the danger passed. The passage is extremely brief and leaves several questions unanswered. Readers have debated exactly how its details should be understood. What is clear is that circumcision was connected to the covenant established with Abraham, and the incident occurs precisely as Moses is being sent to represent the covenant God before Israel. The text gives no room for treating Moses as though his calling placed him above covenant responsibility. The deliverer himself had to stand under the authority of the God who sent him. Meanwhile, Aaron was also moving. God told Aaron to go into the wilderness to meet Moses. The brothers met at the mountain of God. For Moses, this reunion connected worlds separated by decades. Aaron belonged to the people still living under Egyptian oppression. Moses was returning from exile. Now they would enter Egypt together. Moses told Aaron everything God had said and showed him the signs he had been commanded to perform. Then they gathered the elders of Israel. Aaron spoke the words God had given Moses. The signs were performed before the people. And something happened that Moses had feared might never happen. The people believed. When they heard that the Lord had visited the Israelites and seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. This was the first great confirmation of Moses' call. The people who had once questioned his authority now listened. But belief among the elders was not the same thing as victory over Pharaoh. The brothers still had to enter the presence of the king, and when they did, they delivered the message that would define the conflict. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh's response revealed the problem immediately. "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go?" Then he answered his own question with defiance. "I do not know the Lord, and moreover I will not let Israel go." This was not simply a disagreement over labor policy. Pharaoh's words transformed the confrontation into a question of authority. Who had the right to command the God of Israel or the king of Egypt? Moses and Aaron repeated their request, but Pharaoh interpreted it as evidence that the Israelites had too much free time. Instead of reducing their burden, he increased it. Israelite laborers had been required to make bricks using straw supplied through the Egyptian system. Pharaoh now ordered that the straw no longer be provided. The Israelites themselves would have to gather it, but their brick quota would remain unchanged. It was a deliberately impossible demand. Produce the same amount, with fewer resources, and receive punishment when you fail. The Israelite foremen were beaten. They cried out to Pharaoh, asking why they were being treated this way. His answer was cold. "You are idle." The request to worship God was dismissed as laziness. The foremen realized they were in serious trouble, and when they came out from Pharaoh's presence, they encountered Moses and Aaron waiting for them. Their frustration exploded. Instead of thanking Moses for beginning a liberation movement, they blamed him. They accused Moses and Aaron of making them offensive in Pharaoh's sight and placing a sword in the hands of the Egyptians to kill them. The mission had barely begun, and from the perspective of the slaves, everything was worse. This is one of the most important moments in Moses' development as a leader. At the burning bush, he feared that Israel would not believe him. At first, they did. But now Pharaoh had retaliated. Trust was already collapsing. Moses turned back to God with words that sound less like heroic certainty and more like anguish. "Why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me?" He pointed to the evidence. Since Moses had gone to Pharaoh, the king had done more harm to Israel, and from Moses' perspective, deliverance had not happened. This is not the Moses standing at the Red Sea with his staff raised. Not yet. This is a man confronting the gap between promise and immediate reality. God had said he had seen Israel's suffering. God had said he would deliver them. God had sent Moses. Moses obeyed. And Pharaoh responded by tightening the chains. Sometimes the first effect of confrontation is not relief. It is resistance. Pharaoh had no intention of surrendering the labor force that supported his kingdom simply because two Hebrew brothers arrived with a message from a God he claimed not to know. But the story was about to reveal something Pharaoh did not understand. Moses had entered the palace asking for Israel to be released. Pharaoh believed he had answered the question. He had said no. But Pharaoh had mistaken the request for a negotiation. The next stage would show him that he was not negotiating with Moses. God renewed his promise. He reminded Moses again of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He declared that Israel would be brought out from under the burdens of Egypt, delivered from slavery, redeemed with an outstretched arm and great acts of judgment. "I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God." Deliverance would not end at the border of Egypt. Israel was being brought out for a relationship, a covenant, and a future. But when Moses told this to the Israelites, they did not listen. Exodus gives the reason with painful simplicity. Their broken spirit and harsh slavery had exhausted them. Hope itself had become difficult. Then God told Moses once more to go to Pharaoh. Moses objected again. If Israel would not listen to him, why would Pharaoh? Yet the command remained. Moses and Aaron were sent back. And this time, the confrontation would no longer center on arguments. Pharaoh had asked, "Who is the Lord?" Egypt was about to receive an answer. Moses and Aaron entered the royal presence again. Aaron threw down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants. It became a serpent. But Pharaoh summoned his wise men and magicians, and by their secret arts they also produced signs. For a moment Pharaoh could interpret what he saw as something Egypt could imitate. Then Aaron's staff swallowed their staffs. Even before the first plague, the pattern had begun. Pharaoh would see evidence. He would resist. His confidence would harden, and the conflict would escalate. The Nile waited outside the palace, the river that had sustained Egypt, the river into which Hebrew boys had once been ordered thrown, the river from which Moses himself had been drawn alive. Soon Moses would stand beside it again, but this time he would not be a helpless child floating among the reeds. He would stand there with a staff in his hand and a message from the God Pharaoh claimed not to know. The first blow against Egypt was about to fall. And when it did, there would be no returning to ordinary life for Moses, Pharaoh, or Israel. The Nile had always been one of Egypt's greatest symbols of life. Its waters nourished fields, sustained cities, supported agriculture, and made civilization possible in a land surrounded by desert. Generations had depended on its rhythms. But when Moses returned to the river, the Nile became the setting for the first great act of judgment. This was the same river into which Pharaoh had ordered Hebrew boys to be thrown, the same river from which Moses had been drawn alive. Now Moses stood beside it, as the representative of the people Egypt had enslaved. God instructed him to confront Pharaoh in the morning as the king went out to the water. Moses carried the staff that had once been an ordinary shepherd's tool. The message was direct. Pharaoh had refused to listen. So the Lord would make himself known. Aaron stretched out the staff over the waters of Egypt. The Nile turned to blood. Fish died. The rivers stank. The Egyptians could not drink its water. Even water stored in containers was affected, according to the narrative. Egyptian magicians reproduced something resembling the sign through their secret arts, and Pharaoh remained unmoved. He turned and went into his house. The first plague had struck the river at the heart of Egyptian life, yet Pharaoh still would not listen. For 7 days, Egypt lived with the consequences. Then came the second plague, frogs. They came out of the waters and moved into houses, bedrooms, ovens, and kneading bowls. The creatures invaded spaces where no one could ignore them. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. For the first time, he asked Moses to pray for relief. He even promised that if the frogs were removed, the people could go and sacrifice to the Lord. Moses allowed Pharaoh to choose the time when the frogs would be removed. Pharaoh said, "Tomorrow." The next day, the frogs died. They were gathered in heaps. The land smelled of decay. But when Pharaoh saw that relief had come, he hardened his heart and refused to listen. That pattern would repeat again and again. Crisis produced negotiation. Relief produced resistance. Pharaoh wanted freedom from the consequences without surrendering control. The third plague came when Aaron struck the dust of the earth. Gnats, or possibly another kind of small biting insect, depending on translation, spread through Egypt. The magicians attempted to reproduce the sign. This time, they failed. Their conclusion was striking. This is the finger of God. Men who had previously imitated signs now recognized a power beyond their ability. Pharaoh still refused. The fourth plague brought swarms of flies or other destructive insects. But now, Exodus makes an important distinction. The land of Goshen, where Israel lived, was protected. Egypt suffered. Israel did not. The separation carried a message. The disasters were not random natural events passing through the region without purpose. The narrative presents them as acts of judgment under divine control. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron again. He offered a compromise. Israel could sacrifice, but only inside Egypt. Moses rejected the offer. They had been commanded to journey away from the land. Pharaoh then offered a second compromise. They could go into the wilderness, but they must not go very far. Again, Pharaoh asked Moses to pray. Again, Moses prayed. Again, the plague stopped. And again, Pharaoh refused to release Israel. Each cycle exposed the same problem. Pharaoh was willing to negotiate during pain. He was unwilling to obey once the pain passed. Then came a severe plague upon Egyptian livestock. Horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats belonging to the Egyptians were struck. Yet the livestock of Israel were preserved. Pharaoh sent officials to investigate. He learned that the Israelite livestock remained alive. Still, he would not let the people go. The resistance was no longer based on lack of evidence. Pharaoh was seeing distinctions. He was seeing consequences. He was hearing warnings before judgments arrived, and still he refused. Next, Moses and Aaron took soot from a kiln. Moses threw it into the air before Pharaoh. Fine dust spread through the land, and painful boils broke out on people and animals. The Egyptian magicians could not even stand before Moses because they themselves were covered with boils. Those who had once stood in Pharaoh's court as competitors to Moses were now physically unable to remain in the confrontation. Yet the conflict continued. Then came one of the most dramatic warnings. Hail. Moses told Pharaoh that a storm unlike anything Egypt had experienced would strike the land. But the warning included an opportunity. Egyptians who feared the word of the Lord could bring their servants and livestock into shelter. Some listened. Others ignored it. That detail matters. Even within Egypt, people were being confronted not only with disaster, but with a choice about whether to take the warning seriously. Moses stretched out his staff toward heaven. Thunder broke, fire flashed, hail fell with devastating force. Crops were destroyed, trees were shattered, people and animals left in the fields were struck. Yet Goshen remained protected. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. This time his words became stronger. "I have sinned this time." He said that the Lord was righteous and that he and his people were wrong. He asked Moses to pray for the storm to stop. Moses agreed. But Moses also told Pharaoh that he knew the king and his servants did not yet truly fear the Lord. When Moses left the city and spread out his hands, the thunder and hail stopped. Pharaoh saw the relief, and once again he hardened his heart. His confession had lasted only as long as the storm. The seventh plague ended, but Egypt's suffering had not. Moses returned with another warning. Locusts were coming. Anything left after the hail would be consumed. At this point, even Pharaoh's servants began questioning their king. "How long shall this man be a snare to us?" They urged Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. "Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined?" The words are remarkable because they show the political cost of Pharaoh's stubbornness. The conflict was no longer merely between Moses and the king. People inside Pharaoh's own system could see the destruction accumulating. Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron back. He asked who exactly would go to worship. Moses answered that everyone would go, young and old, sons and daughters, flocks and herds. This was not a temporary religious delegation while families and property remained under Egyptian control. Israel would leave as a people. Pharaoh refused. He offered another compromise. The men could go, but the families must remain. Moses did not accept. The plague came. An east wind blew across the land, bringing locusts in vast numbers. They covered the ground until it appeared dark. Whatever vegetation remained after the hail disappeared. Egypt was being stripped, layer by layer. Pharaoh quickly called for Moses and Aaron. Again he confessed, "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you." Again he asked forgiveness. Again Moses prayed. A strong wind carried the locusts away, and again Pharaoh refused. Then the ninth plague came without the kind of extended confrontation that had preceded some of the others. Darkness covered Egypt for 3 days. It was described as darkness that could be felt. People could not see one another. They did not move from where they were. But the Israelites had light where they lived. For a civilization accustomed to the brilliance of the sun over the Nile Valley, darkness carried extraordinary symbolic weight. The narrative does not require us to speculate about every possible connection to Egyptian religion. What it does clearly present is another moment when the land, the people, and even the rhythms of light and darkness were beyond Pharaoh's control. Pharaoh called Moses again. This time he offered another concession. The people could go, the children could go, but the flocks and herds must remain. Moses refused. The livestock were necessary for worship, and they would not know all that was required until they arrived. Nothing would remain behind, not one hoof. Pharaoh became furious. He told Moses to leave his presence. He warned him never to appear before him again. If Moses saw Pharaoh's face again, Pharaoh said, Moses would die. Moses answered that Pharaoh had spoken correctly. The cycle of negotiations was almost over. No more partial concessions, no more temporary promises, no more bargaining over which members of Israel could leave. The confrontation was approaching its final and most terrible night. Before it came, God gave Moses instructions concerning what Israel was to do. The people were told to ask the Egyptians for silver and gold items. Exodus says the Israelites found favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, and Moses himself had become highly regarded among Pharaoh's officials and the people. This is another reversal. Moses had once fled Egypt as a criminal. Now, after repeated confrontations, his name carried weight even among those inside the empire. But the final warning was not about rivers, insects, disease, storms, crops, or darkness. It was about Egypt's firstborn. Moses announced that around midnight the Lord would go through Egypt. Every firstborn in the land would die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh on the throne to the firstborn of the lowest servant, and also the firstborn among livestock. A great cry would rise throughout Egypt, but Israel would be distinguished from Egypt. The judgment would reveal again that Pharaoh did not possess final authority over life, death, or the people he had claimed as his slaves. Moses left Pharaoh's presence in anger. Then Israel received instructions for a meal that would become one of the defining memorials in biblical history. Passover. Each household was to take a lamb. The animal was to be without defect. At the appointed time, it would be killed. Its blood would be placed on the sides and top of the doorway. The meat would be eaten that night with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. The people were to eat dressed for departure, belts fastened, sandals on, staffs in hand. This was not a leisurely meal. It was food for people about to move. God declared that he would pass through Egypt that night. When he saw the blood on the houses where Israel gathered, judgment would pass over them. The blood marked those homes as belonging to people who had trusted the instruction given to them. Israel was also commanded to remember this event in generations to come. The feast would become a lasting memorial. Children would ask what it meant. Parents would tell the story. The Exodus was not supposed to become a vague national legend. It would be rehearsed, remembered, taught. The people obeyed. Then night came. For generations, Hebrew families had gone to sleep under the power of Pharaoh. That night would be different. Behind blood-marked doorways, Israel waited. Outside, Egypt remained unaware of exactly how close the final judgment had come. At midnight, the firstborn throughout Egypt died. The text moves quickly, but the scale is devastating. Pharaoh rose in the night, his servants rose, the Egyptians rose, and a great cry filled the land. There was no household untouched by death. Pharaoh had once ordered the death of Israel's sons. Now grief had entered his own house. The firstborn son of Pharaoh died. The king summoned Moses and Aaron during the night. There was no bargaining now, no restriction on children, no demand that livestock remain. Rise up, go out from among my people. Take the Israelites, take the flocks, take the herds, go. Worship as you have said. And then Pharaoh added a request that would have seemed almost unimaginable at the beginning of the conflict. Bless me also. The king who had asked, "Who is the Lord?" now asked the servants of the Lord for blessing. Egypt urged Israel to leave quickly. The people feared that if Israel remained, more death would come. So Israel prepared to depart before the dough had time to rise. They carried kneading bowls wrapped in clothing. They received silver, gold, and clothing from the Egyptians. And after generations of slavery, an enormous company began moving out of the land. Exodus describes about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children, along with a mixed multitude and large numbers of livestock. The interpretation of ancient population figures has generated substantial scholarly discussion, especially concerning how some Hebrew numerical terms should be understood. For purposes of the biblical narrative, however, the central point is unmistakable. Israel did not leave Egypt as one small household. The family that had once entered Egypt during Joseph's generation was now leaving as a people. The night of Passover became the night of departure. 4 centuries of covenant history stood behind them. A new chapter lay ahead. But they were not yet safe. Freedom from a place is not the same thing as freedom from its power. Pharaoh had given the order to leave while Egypt was overwhelmed by grief. But once the immediate terror passed, another thought began to grow. Egypt had lost its forced labor. The king and his officials asked what they had done. Why had they released Israel from serving them? Pharaoh changed his mind. Chariots were prepared, his army mobilized. He took hundreds of chosen chariots along with the rest of the Egyptian chariot force and officers. The empire that had told Israel to leave now went after them. Meanwhile, God did not lead Israel by the shortest possible road toward Canaan. The direct route could have taken them toward conflict with the Philistines, and the narrative explains that God led them another way, because the people might see war and return to Egypt. The Israelites moved toward the wilderness by the Red Sea. Moses also carried the bones of Joseph. Centuries earlier, Joseph had made the sons of Israel swear that when God visited them, they would carry his bones out of Egypt. Now that promise was being fulfilled. Joseph, whose rise had once brought Israel into Egypt, was symbolically leaving with the people. God's presence guided them. By day, a pillar of cloud went before them. By night, a pillar of fire gave light. The sign did not depart. They were free. They had guidance. They had survived the night Egypt broke. Then someone looked behind them. Chariots, dust, an army. Pharaoh was coming. The people panicked. Before them was the sea. Behind them was the military power of the kingdom they had just escaped. The Israelites cried out to God. Then they turned on Moses. Their words were bitter. Were there no graves in Egypt that you brought us into the wilderness to die? It was a cruel accusation in a land famous for its tombs. They reminded Moses that they had warned him to leave them alone. Slavery suddenly appeared safer than death. The people who had walked out of Egypt now wanted to reinterpret bondage as security. Fear can make captivity look familiar enough to seem preferable. Moses stood before them. His situation was impossible by ordinary calculation. There was no bridge, no fleet, no obvious road around the water, no army capable of matching Pharaoh's chariots. The Exodus appeared to have led directly into a trap. But Moses told the people not to be afraid. Stand firm. They would see the salvation of the Lord. The Egyptians they saw that day, he said, they would never see again in the same way. The Lord will fight for you. Then came a command that would become one of the defining moments of Moses' life. Move forward. The pillar that had been leading Israel shifted behind them, standing between the Israelites and Egypt's army. Darkness separated one side. Light remained for the other. Through the night, the two camps did not come together. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. A strong east wind drove the waters back. Dry ground appeared. The sea divided. Israel entered. Imagine the reversal. At the beginning of Moses' life, water had seemed to mean death for Hebrew sons. Now water opened a road to freedom for the entire people. They walked through, with the waters forming barriers on either side. Egypt pursued. Horses, chariots, horsemen. Pharaoh's forces followed Israel into the sea. Then the Egyptian army began to fall into confusion. Chariot wheels became difficult to manage. The Egyptians recognized that something had changed. The Lord fights for them against Egypt. But recognition came too late. God told Moses to stretch out his hand again. The waters returned. The Egyptians attempted to flee. The sea covered the chariots and horsemen. The force that had pursued Israel into the passage was destroyed. Israel stood on the opposite shore. Egypt's army did not. Exodus describes the people seeing the Egyptians dead on the seashore. The power that had terrified them hours earlier had been broken. Israel saw the great power displayed against Egypt. They feared the Lord. They believed in him and in Moses, his servant. For Moses, this moment was unlike anything before it. As an infant, he had been helpless beside the Nile. As a young man, he had killed one Egyptian and fled. As a shepherd, he had argued that he was not the man to confront Pharaoh. Now he stood with an entire nation on the far side of the sea. Pharaoh's palace was behind them. Egypt's army was behind them. The land of slavery was behind them. Moses and the Israelites sang. The song celebrated God as the one who had thrown horse and rider into the sea. Miriam, Moses' sister, the girl who had once watched a basket among the reeds, now appeared as a prophetess. She took a tambourine. Women went out after her with tambourines and dancing. She called Israel to sing because the Lord had triumphed gloriously. Few lives contain a reversal like hers. She had once stood at the Nile, wondering whether her baby brother would survive. Now she stood beside another body of water, celebrating the defeat of the power that had tried to kill him. The Exodus had reached one of its greatest climaxes. But the story of Moses was nowhere near finished. In some ways, confronting Pharaoh would prove simpler than what came next. Pharaoh had been one enemy. The wilderness would expose thousands of fears. At the sea, Israel believed. But faith formed during a miracle would soon be tested by thirst. The songs had barely ended when Moses led the people away from the Red Sea into the wilderness of Shur. For 3 days they found no water. When they finally reached water at Marah, they discovered that it was bitter. The people complained against Moses. "What shall we drink?" The celebration by the sea had lasted only a short time before the first wilderness crisis. Moses cried out to God. The waters became drinkable. Then Israel came to Elim, where there were springs of water and palm trees, a moment of rest. But soon hunger replaced thirst. The congregation complained again. This time their memory of Egypt began to change. They spoke as though Egypt had been a place where they sat beside pots of meat and ate bread until they were full. They accused Moses and Aaron of bringing them into the wilderness to kill them with hunger. That accusation would become a pattern. Every crisis raised the same hidden question. Had God brought them out merely to let them die? God responded with provision. Bread would come from heaven. In the evening, quail covered the camp. In the morning, a fine substance appeared on the ground. The Israelites looked at it and asked, "What is it?" That question is connected to the name manna. Each household gathered what was needed. They were told not to hoard it overnight, except in preparation for the Sabbath. Some ignored the instruction. The stored manna bred worms. The lesson was not only about food. Israel was learning dependence. In Egypt, their lives had been controlled by Pharaoh's system. In the wilderness, they would have to learn to trust God day by day. Then water became a crisis again at Rephidim. There was none for the people to drink. They quarreled with Moses. "Give us water!" Moses asked why they were testing the Lord. But the people's fear intensified. "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and livestock with thirst?" Moses cried out to God. "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." The man who had once worried that Israel would not accept his leadership now carried responsibility for their survival in a desert. God told him to take elders of Israel and the staff with which he had struck the Nile. Moses struck the rock at Horeb. Water came out. The people drank, but before the camp could settle, another danger arrived. Amalek attacked Israel. This was not a problem of food or water. It was war. Moses told Joshua to choose men and fight. Joshua now began to emerge as an important figure in the story. While Joshua led the battle below, Moses stood on a hill with the staff of God in his hand.
When Moses held up his hands, Israel prevailed. When his hands lowered, Amalek gained ground. But Moses grew tired. Aaron and Hur placed a stone beneath him. They supported his hands, one on each side.
His hands remained steady until sunset.
Joshua defeated Amalek's forces. The scene carries another important lesson about Moses' leadership. He was central, but he was not sufficient by himself. Aaron supported him. Hur supported him. Joshua fought below. Israel's future would not depend on one man functioning alone. That truth became even clearer when Jethro arrived. Moses' father-in-law heard what God had done for Moses and Israel. He came to Moses in the wilderness bringing Zipporah and Moses' sons.
Moses told Jethro about what had happened to Pharaoh and Egypt and about the hardships Israel had faced on the journey. Jethro rejoiced and praised God for the deliverance. Then the next day he watched Moses work. From morning until evening, people stood around Moses while he judged disputes. Jethro asked what he was doing. Why was Moses sitting alone while everyone waited? Moses explained that the people came to him to seek God's judgment and to settle disputes. Jethro's response was direct. "What you are doing is not good." The burden was too heavy. Moses would wear himself out. So Jethro advised him to teach the people God's statutes and laws while appointing capable, trustworthy men to handle smaller matters. The difficult cases could still come to Moses. Moses listened. It was a significant moment. The prophet who confronted Pharaoh also needed practical wisdom about administration. Delivering a nation was one kind of leadership. Organizing that nation was another. Then, in the 3rd month after leaving Egypt, Israel arrived in the wilderness of Sinai. They camped before the mountain. Moses went up to God. The promise given at the burning bush had come full circle. God had told Moses that after he brought the people out of Egypt, they would worship at this mountain. Now they were here. The fugitive shepherd had returned to Horeb. But he did not return alone. An entire people stood at the foot of the mountain. God told Moses to remind Israel what they had seen. They had witnessed what he did to Egypt. He had carried them in the language of the text on eagle's wings and brought them to himself. Then came the purpose of their deliverance. If Israel obeyed God's voice and kept his covenant, they would be his treasured possession among the nations, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That changes the meaning of Exodus. Israel had not been freed merely to become an independent population wandering wherever it wished. They were being brought into covenant. Freedom was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of responsibility. Moses gathered the elders. He presented the words. The people answered together, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." It was a sweeping promise. Soon they would discover how difficult it was to keep. The mountain was prepared. Boundaries were established. The people consecrated themselves. On the 3rd day, thunder and lightning covered the mountain. A thick cloud descended. A trumpet sounded with increasing force. The people trembled. Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. The mountain shook. Moses spoke. God answered. The former shepherd stood at the center of a moment that would shape Israel's identity for generations. Then came the words later known as the 10 Commandments. No other gods, no idols. Do not misuse the name of the Lord. Remember the Sabbath. Honor father and mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not covet. These commandments did not appear in a vacuum. They were given to a people who had already been rescued. God began by reminding Israel of what he had done. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The relationship began with deliverance. Then came covenant obligation.
The people were overwhelmed by the thunder, fire, trumpet, and smoke. They stood at a distance. They asked Moses to speak to them instead. They feared that if God spoke directly, they would die. Moses became increasingly central as mediator between God and Israel. More covenant laws followed. Instructions addressed worship, justice, servants, property, violence, restitution, festivals, and community life. Then the covenant was formally confirmed. Moses built an altar, sacrifices were offered, blood was used in the covenant ceremony. The people again declared that they would obey everything the Lord had spoken.
Moses then went farther up the mountain.
The glory of the Lord rested on Sinai. To Israel below, it appeared like consuming fire on the summit. Moses entered the cloud, and he remained on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. There he received instructions for the tabernacle, the priesthood, sacred objects, worship, and the sign of the Sabbath. The tabernacle would become the portable sanctuary at the center of Israel's camp. Its importance was profound. The God who had brought Israel out of Egypt would dwell among them.
But while Moses remained on the mountain, receiving instructions about worship, the people below began to lose patience. Days passed. Moses did not return. The mountain still towered above them, but the visible leader who had brought them through Egypt and the sea was absent. The people gathered around Aaron. They demanded, "Come, make us gods who shall go before us." Then they added words filled with painful irony. "As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." They had watched the Nile turn to blood. They had eaten Passover. They had crossed the sea. They had eaten manna. They had drunk water from the rock. They had heard the covenant at Sinai. And yet now, they wanted a visible image to lead them. Aaron told them to bring gold earrings. He received the gold. He fashioned it into a calf. The people declared, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." The language transferred the glory of Exodus to an image made by human hands. Aaron built an altar before it. A festival was proclaimed. Offerings were presented. The people ate, drank, and rose up in celebration. At the top of the mountain, God told Moses what was happening. "Go down." The people had corrupted themselves quickly. The covenant they had promised to obey was being violated while its mediator was still receiving its terms. God spoke of judgment. Moses interceded. He appealed to what Egypt would say if Israel were destroyed. He appealed to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, and to the covenant promises. Then Moses descended the mountain. In his hands were the tablets of testimony. Joshua, who had been waiting lower on the mountain, heard the noise from the camp and thought there might be the sound of war. Moses knew otherwise. As he approached, he saw the calf. He saw the dancing, and his anger burned. The tablets in his hands represented the covenant Israel had just promised to keep. Moses threw them down. They shattered at the foot of the mountain. The image was impossible to miss. The covenant was broken before Israel had even left Sinai. Moses took the calf. He burned it, ground it into powder, scattered it on water, made the Israelites drink. Then he turned to Aaron. "What did this people do to you that you have brought such a great sin upon them?" Aaron's answer revealed how quickly responsibility can be avoided. He blamed the people. They were set on evil. They gave him gold. He threw it into the fire, and as Aaron described it, out came this calf. The explanation almost tried to make the idol sound accidental, but the text had already said Aaron fashioned it. Moses then saw that the people were out of control. He stood at the entrance of the camp and called, "Who is on the Lord's side?" The sons of Levi gathered to him. What followed was severe judgment within the camp. Many died. The next day Moses told the people they had committed a great sin. Then he did something extraordinary. He returned to God to intercede. He acknowledged Israel's guilt.
They had made gods of gold. Then Moses pleaded for forgiveness. And if forgiveness were not possible, he said, "Blot me out of your book." Moses had once fled Israel after killing one Egyptian. Now he stood before God, pleading on behalf of the very people who had repeatedly challenged him and broken the covenant. His role had changed. He was no longer simply the man who delivered messages. He had become an intercessor. Yet sin had consequences. Judgment came upon the people, and a deeper crisis remained. If Israel could violate the covenant so quickly, how could a holy God dwell among them? God told Moses to lead the people onward toward the promised land. An angel would go before them. But the people heard devastating words. God said he would not go up in their midst in the same way because they were a stiff-necked people and might be consumed. Israel mourned. This was now the real danger, not Pharaoh, not hunger, not Amalek. The greatest threat was the rupture between a holy God and a rebellious people. Moses pitched a tent outside the camp. There he met with God. When Moses entered, the pillar of cloud descended. The people watched from their own tents. Exodus describes the Lord speaking with Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend, a phrase emphasizing the extraordinary directness of Moses' relationship with God, even though other passages make clear that Moses did not behold God's full, unveiled glory. Moses pleaded again. If God's presence did not go with Israel, Moses said they should not leave. What would distinguish Israel from every other people if God did not go with them? God answered, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Moses asked for something more. "Show me your glory." The request took the story beyond political liberation. Moses had seen signs. He had seen the sea divided. He had heard God at Sinai. Yet he wanted to know more of the God he served. God told Moses that he could not see his face fully and live. Moses would be placed in a cleft of the rock. God's goodness would pass before him. Moses would receive a protected revelation. Then Moses was told to cut 2 new tablets like the first. The covenant was not going to remain shattered at the bottom of Sinai. He climbed the mountain again. God proclaimed his name and character before Moses, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, yet not treating guilt as though it did not matter. Mercy and justice stood together. Moses bowed to the ground. He pleaded again that God would go among Israel, forgive their sin, and take them as his inheritance. The covenant was renewed. Moses remained with God 40 days and 40 nights. When he descended, carrying the new tablets, something had changed in his appearance. The skin of his face shone because he had been speaking with God. Aaron and the Israelites were afraid to come near him. Moses called them. He gave them the commands he had received. When he finished speaking, he placed a veil over his face, removing it when he went before the Lord. The man who had once complained that he could not speak now stood before an entire nation with the reflected glory of his encounters with God visible on his face. Then the tabernacle was built. The people contributed materials. Skilled craftsmen worked. Bezalel and Aholiab were entrusted with major responsibilities. Curtains, frames, furnishings, priestly garments, altars, the lampstand and the ark were prepared according to the instructions Moses had received. The work required order and precision. At last, on the first day of the first month of the 2nd year after leaving Egypt, the tabernacle was erected. Moses inspected the work. Everything had been completed. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting. The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter because the glory had settled upon it. The same presence that had appeared in the burning bush guided Israel through cloud and fire and descended upon Sinai now filled the sanctuary in the center of the camp. Whenever the cloud lifted, Israel traveled. When it remained, they stayed. By day it was visible as cloud. By night, fire appeared within it. The Exodus had moved from slavery to deliverance, from deliverance to covenant, and from covenant crisis to restored presence. At this point, the journey might seem ready to reach its destination. Egypt was behind them. The tabernacle stood complete. God's presence was among them. A structured nation was forming. Priests were appointed. Laws were given. The promised land was ahead. But one problem had not been solved: Israel itself. The golden calf had shown how quickly fear could become idolatry. The complaints over food and water had shown how quickly memory could distort the past. And soon, when the people came near enough to see the land promised to their ancestors, they would face a decision more consequential than any complaint so far. The question would no longer be whether Pharaoh would let them go. Pharaoh was gone. The question would be whether Israel actually trusted the God who had brought them this far. 12 men would soon walk into Canaan. All 12 would see the same land. All 12 would see the same cities. All 12 would return to the same camp. But 10 would interpret what they saw through fear. 2 would interpret it through faith.
And an entire generation would live with the consequences. Israel had escaped Egypt. They had crossed the sea. They had stood before Sinai. They had received the covenant. The tabernacle had been built, the priesthood established, and the presence of God now rested visibly among them. Everything seemed to be moving toward the promise given generations earlier to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The land was ahead, but before Israel could enter it, the people would face a test that exposed something more dangerous than Pharaoh's army: fear. The wilderness journey continued. Israel moved from Sinai according to the cloud that rose above the tabernacle. The camp traveled in an organized formation, tribe by tribe, under the guidance of the presence that had led them from Egypt. But order on the outside did not mean trust had taken root on the inside. Complaining returned. The people began speaking about their hardships. The wilderness was difficult, the food was repetitive, the future was uncertain. And once again, memory began reshaping Egypt.
Some among them spoke longingly about the food they remembered: fish, cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, garlic. The contrast is almost painful. Egypt had been the land where their sons were threatened, their labor was exploited, and their people cried out under slavery. Yet now the memory of food was beginning to soften the memory of bondage. They looked at the manna and complained. Moses heard the people weeping family by family at the entrances of their tents. The burden of leadership became overwhelming. He turned to God with startling honesty. Why had this responsibility been placed on him? Had he conceived all these people? Had he given birth to them? Why was he expected to carry them like a nurse carries a child? The words reveal the pressure Moses was under. He had faced Pharaoh. He had stood at the Red Sea. He had climbed Sinai. But leading a liberated people through daily frustration was consuming him in a different way.
Moses admitted that he could not carry the people alone. God responded by appointing 70 elders to help bear the burden of leadership. The spirit that rested upon Moses would also rest upon them, so that he would not have to carry everything by himself. Again, the lesson was clear. Moses was essential, but he was never meant to be sufficient alone. God also promised me, and for the people not merely for one day, but until their craving became repulsive to them. Moses struggled to understand how such a massive population could be supplied in the wilderness. Would flocks and herds be slaughtered? Would all the fish of the sea somehow be gathered? The response challenged Moses himself. Is the Lord's hand shortened? Even the leader who had seen the sea open could still reach moments where circumstances appeared larger than the promise. Quail came. The people gathered enormous quantities.
But judgment also fell because their craving had become part of a deeper rejection.
The place was remembered as Kibroth Hattaavah, associated with the graves of craving. Israel moved on.
Then the challenge against Moses became personal. Miriam and Aaron spoke against him, connected in the text with the Cushite woman he had married. But beneath the complaint was a question about authority. Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? Moses' own brother and sister were now questioning his unique role. The text responds by emphasizing Moses' humility and the distinctive way God communicated with him. Prophets might receive dreams and visions, but Moses was described as having an unusually direct relationship with God. Miriam was struck with a severe skin condition and became white like snow. Aaron immediately recognized their sin. He pleaded with Moses, and Moses, instead of retaliating against the sister who had challenged him, cried out to God for her healing. Miriam remained outside the camp for 7 days before she was restored. The entire nation waited. Then the journey resumed. Each episode was exposing the same pattern. Provision followed complaint. Authority followed challenge. Mercy followed judgment. But the greatest test was still ahead. Israel came to the wilderness of Paran. From there God instructed Moses to send men to explore the land of Canaan. 1 leader from each tribe would go, 12 men. Their assignment was practical. They were to observe the land. What kind of country was it? Were the people strong or weak? Few or many? Were the cities open camps or fortified strongholds? Was the soil fertile? Were there trees? Moses encouraged them to be courageous and bring back some of the fruit. Among the 12 were Joshua from the tribe of Ephraim and Caleb from Judah. The spies entered Canaan. For 40 days they traveled through the land. They saw its cities, its people, its agricultural richness. Near the valley of Eshcol they cut down a cluster of grapes so large that it was carried on a pole between 2 men. They also brought pomegranates and figs. The evidence was visible. The land was fruitful. The promise was not describing an empty wasteland. Then the 12 returned to the camp. Everyone gathered. Moses was there. Aaron was there. The congregation waited. The spies began with agreement. They had gone into the land. It truly flowed with milk and honey. They displayed its fruit. For a moment the report seemed encouraging. Then came one word that changed the atmosphere. However, the people living there were strong. The cities were fortified and very large. The descendants of Anak were there. Other peoples occupied different regions. The Amalekites were in the Negev. Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites occupied the hill country. Canaanites lived near the sea and along the Jordan. The facts themselves were not necessarily false. The land did contain formidable opposition. The problem was how those facts would be interpreted. Caleb quieted the people. His conclusion was immediate. We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. The other spies disagreed. We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. Notice the shift. The question was no longer simply what they had seen. The question was what the people believed those facts meant. 10 spies began spreading a negative report. They described the inhabitants as overwhelming. They spoke of giants. They said they felt like grasshoppers in comparison. Fear magnified every obstacle. The land that had just been praised for its fertility now became a place associated with danger and death. That night the congregation raised its voice and wept. The reaction went far beyond caution. The people grumbled against Moses and Aaron. They asked why they had not died in Egypt or in the wilderness. They accused God of bringing them into the land so that they would fall by the sword and their wives and children would become victims. Then came one of the most tragic proposals in the Exodus journey. Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. They wanted to reverse the Exodus. Think about what that meant. They had watched Egypt's power broken. They had passed through the Red Sea. They had received manna. They had drunk water in the wilderness. They had stood before Sinai. They had watched the glory of God fill the tabernacle. And now, at the edge of the promised land, fear convinced them that slavery might have been the better choice. The greatest threat to Israel's future was no longer behind them, it was inside them. Moses and Aaron fell face down before the assembly.
Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes. They pleaded with the people not to rebel. The land was exceedingly good. If God delighted in them, He would bring them into it. The people of the land should not be feared. The Lord is with us. But the congregation talked about stoning them. The crisis had reached a terrifying point. Israel was not merely afraid of Canaan. They were rejecting the journey itself. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting. God spoke to Moses. "How long will this people despise me? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I have done among them?" The problem was identified clearly. This was not simply a military assessment, it was unbelief. Israel had seen repeated evidence of deliverance and still concluded that God had brought them out to destroy them. God spoke of striking the people and making a greater nation from Moses. It was an extraordinary moment of testing. Moses could have imagined a future in which rebellious Israel disappeared and his own descendants became the new beginning. But again Moses interceded. He appealed to God's reputation among the nations. Egypt had heard what God had done. The peoples of Canaan would also hear. If Israel were destroyed in the wilderness, they might claim that God had been unable to bring His people into the land He had promised. Then Moses appealed to the character God had revealed at Sinai. Slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, yet not ignoring guilt. Moses asked for pardon. God answered. The people would not be completely destroyed. But forgiveness did not mean consequences disappeared. The generation that had seen the signs in Egypt and repeatedly tested God would not enter the promised land. Those counted among the adult generation would die in the wilderness. Caleb would enter because he had responded differently. Joshua would enter as well. The children whom the fearful generation claimed would become victims would be the ones who inherited the land. The irony was severe. The adults said, "Our children will die if we go forward." God answered, in effect, that those children would enter because the adults refused. The spies had explored the land for 40 days. Israel would now experience a corresponding period of 40 years in the wilderness. A year for each day. The journey that might have moved directly toward conquest became a generation-long delay. The 10 spies whose report had fueled rebellion died under judgment. Joshua and Caleb remained. When Moses announced the sentence, the people mourned, but their response produced another failure. The next morning, some of them decided they would now go up into the hill country. Suddenly they were ready to enter. But obedience delayed until after rebellion is not the same thing as obedience. Moses warned them not to go. God was not with them in this attempt. They would be defeated. The Amalekites and Canaanites were ahead. Yet the people went presumptuously. Moses did not move. The ark did not move. The attackers struck them down and chased them. Once again, Israel had moved from one extreme to the other. First, they refused to go when commanded. Then they went when warned not to. Fear and presumption were two forms of the same problem. They were acting according to their own judgment, rather than trusting the instruction given to them. This moment changed the entire story. The Exodus generation had reached the edge of fulfillment and turned away. From that point forward, the wilderness was no longer simply the road between Egypt and Canaan. It became the place where a generation would pass away.
But even after this catastrophic failure, the biblical narrative includes instructions about offerings that Israel would bring after entering the land. That may seem surprising. The current generation had just been told it would not enter, yet the promise itself had not been canceled. The people had failed.
The covenant purpose continued. Their children still had a future. This is one of the central tensions in Moses' story. Human failure repeatedly delayed the journey. It did not erase the promise. But the wilderness years would not be peaceful. Authority would be challenged again. The most dramatic rebellion came from Korah, a Levite, together with Dathan and Abiram and other prominent men. They confronted Moses and Aaron. Their accusations sounded almost democratic on the surface. All the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? The issue was again authority. Had Moses and Aaron taken too much power for themselves, Moses fell face down. He proposed a test. Korah and his followers would bring censers with incense before God. Aaron would do the same. God would make clear whom he had chosen. Moses also confronted Korah with a deeper question. Was it too small a thing that God had separated the Levites for service at the tabernacle? Was Korah now seeking the priesthood as well? The rebellion was not merely against Moses and Aaron. Moses said they were gathering against the Lord. Dathan and Abiram refused even to come when summoned. Their words showed how deeply the Exodus story had been inverted in their minds. They accused Moses of bringing them out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill them in the wilderness. That phrase belonged to Canaan. Now they applied it to Egypt. Slavery had become the promised land in their memory. Deliverance had become deception. The spiritual distortion was almost complete. The confrontation reached its climax. The congregation gathered. Moses warned the people to move away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Then he declared that if these men died an ordinary death, his leadership had not been uniquely commissioned. But if something extraordinary happened, the people would know that these men had rejected the Lord. The earth opened. Dathan and Abiram and those associated with them were swallowed. Fire also consumed the men offering incense. It was severe judgment, but astonishingly, even this did not end the conflict. The next day, the congregation grumbled against Moses and Aaron. "You have killed the people of the Lord." A plague began. Moses told Aaron to take incense quickly and make atonement for the people. Aaron ran into the congregation. He stood between the dead and the living. The plague stopped. The image is one of the most powerful in the wilderness story. Aaron, whose priesthood had just been challenged, now stood literally between death and life for the people who had challenged him. God then provided another sign. A staff from each tribal leader was placed before the Lord. Aaron's staff represented Levi. By the next day, Aaron's staff had sprouted. It produced buds, blossoms, and almonds. The priesthood was confirmed. The rebellion had been answered. Yet the larger wilderness sentence continued. Years passed. The biblical narrative does not record every day of those decades. That silence itself is meaningful. An entire generation lived and died between the rebellion at Kadesh and the final approach to Canaan. Children became adults. Adults became elders. Memories of Egypt became stories told to people too young to remember it. And Moses remained. The man who had once expected to lead Israel out of Egypt and into the Promised Land continued shepherding a nation through the consequences of unbelief. Eventually, the story arrives at the wilderness of Zin. The people stayed at Kadesh. There, Miriam died. The sister who had watched Moses beside the Nile was gone. She had witnessed his rescue as an infant. She had sung after the Red Sea. She had challenged him and been restored. Now her story ended in the wilderness. Then another familiar crisis returned. There was no water. The congregation gathered against Moses and Aaron. They quarreled. Again the old language appeared. Why had Moses brought them into the wilderness? Why had he brought them to a place without grain, figs, vines, pomegranates, or water? Moses and Aaron went to the entrance of the tent of meeting. They fell face down. The glory of the Lord appeared. God gave Moses specific instruction. Take the staff, gather the congregation, speak to the rock before their eyes. The rock would yield water. Moses took the staff. He and Aaron gathered the people. But Moses was angry. "Listen, you rebels!" Then came the question, "Must we bring you water out of this rock?" Moses raised his hand. He struck the rock with a staff, not once, twice. Water came out abundantly. The people drank. The animals drank. From the perspective of the crowd, the crisis was solved. Water had come. But for Moses, something irreversible had happened. God spoke to Moses and Aaron. "Because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." The words must have landed with extraordinary weight. Moses had faced Pharaoh for this journey. He had crossed the sea for this journey. He had climbed Sinai for this journey. He had endured complaints, rebellion, threats, hunger, thirst, war, and decades of wilderness wandering for this journey. And now he was told he would not complete it. The exact nature of Moses' offense has been discussed in different ways. The text clearly emphasizes failure to trust God and uphold him as holy before Israel. It is therefore safest not to reduce the entire event to one mechanical detail, as though the only issue were simply that Moses struck the rock instead of speaking to it. His action, his words, and the way he represented God before the people all belong to the seriousness of the moment. Moses was the mediator. He held extraordinary responsibility, and extraordinary responsibility did not exempt him from accountability. The water became associated with Meribah, the place of quarreling. Israel had tested God there. But Moses too had failed under pressure. The wilderness had exposed Pharaoh. It had exposed Israel. Now it exposed Moses. This is one reason Scripture's portrait of him carries such weight. The Bible does not preserve Moses as a flawless hero. His failures at the beginning of his life are not erased by his calling. His frustrations during leadership are not hidden by his miracles. And his unique relationship with God does not cancel the consequence of disobedience. Soon another loss would come. Israel journeyed toward Mount Hor. God told Moses and Aaron that Aaron would be gathered to his people. He too would not enter the promised land because of the rebellion at Meribah. Moses took Aaron and Aaron's son Eleazar up the mountain. There Moses removed Aaron's priestly garments. He placed them on Eleazar. The priesthood passed from father to son. Then Aaron died on the mountain. Moses came down with Eleazar. When the congregation realized Aaron was dead, the entire house of Israel mourned for 30 days. Another pillar of Moses' life was gone. Miriam was dead. Aaron was dead. The generation that had left Egypt was disappearing. Moses remained, but his own future had now been limited. He could lead Israel closer. He could prepare them. He could teach them. He could fight battles. He could appoint a successor. But he would not cross the Jordan. And Israel was not finished testing him. As they traveled around Edom, the people became impatient. They spoke against God and Moses. "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness?" They complained about food again. They despised the manna. Then poisonous serpents came among the people, and many died. The people recognized their sin. "We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you." They asked Moses to pray. Again he interceded. God instructed Moses to make a bronze serpent and raise it on a pole. Anyone bitten could look at it and live.
The object itself was not presented as an independent source of power. The healing came through trusting the provision God had given. Much later, the bronze serpent would itself become an object of misuse and would be destroyed during King Hezekiah's reforms. But here in the wilderness, it became another example of judgment followed by mercy. Israel continued moving. The old generation was fading. A new one was coming of age. And for the first time in decades, the geography of the story began to feel different. They were moving toward the eastern side of the Jordan.
The land once rejected in fear was drawing near again. But the road would not open without conflict. Kings would oppose them. Armies would stand in their path. A foreign ruler would hire a prophet to curse them. And while Israel's enemies tried to destroy them from the outside, temptation would again threaten them from within. Moses had already lost the right to enter the land. Now he had to complete one final task more difficult than defeating Pharaoh. He had to prepare a generation to finish a mission without him. By the time Israel began moving toward the lands east of the Jordan, the story no longer belonged to the same generation that had stood trembling at the Red Sea. The adults who had left Egypt had spent decades in the wilderness. Many were gone. Miriam was gone. Aaron was gone, and Moses, though still leading the people, now knew that his own journey would end before Israel crossed into Canaan. The wilderness had changed everyone. A younger generation had grown up under the cloud, eaten manna, heard the stories of Egypt, and watched their parents die one by one because of the unbelief that had turned a short journey into 40 years. Now the promise was drawing near again, but before Israel reached the Jordan, they would have to pass through dangerous territory. And the next stage of the journey would show that the wilderness generation had not merely been waiting. A new people was being prepared. Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites. The request was peaceful. They asked permission to pass through his land. They promised not to turn aside into fields or vineyards. They would not drink water from wells without permission. They would stay on the king's highway until they had passed through the territory. Sihon refused. Instead of granting passage, he gathered his army and marched against Israel. The two forces met at Jahaz. Israel defeated him. They took possession of his land from the Arnon to the Jabbok. Cities that had seemed impossible to conquer to the previous generation were now falling before their children. The symbolism was difficult to miss. 38 years earlier, Israel had looked at fortified cities in Canaan and concluded that entering the land was impossible. Now, east of the Jordan, fortified territory was already coming under Israel's control. They continued northward. Og, king of Bashan, came against them with his army. God told Moses not to fear him. Israel defeated Og as well. The biblical narrative emphasizes these victories because they changed the strategic position of the people. For the first time, Israel possessed substantial territory east of the Jordan. They were no longer a wandering population moving without foothold. They were beginning to stand at the threshold of inheritance. And neighboring rulers noticed. Among them was Balak, king of Moab. He had seen what Israel had done to the Amorites. He was afraid. Israel was numerous. Their victories were growing. Balak believed military resistance alone might not be enough. So he turned to another strategy. He sent messengers to a man named Balaam. Balaam was known as a diviner whose blessing and curse carried a powerful reputation. Balak's message was simple. A people had come out of Egypt. They covered the face of the land. They were settling nearby. Balak wanted Balaam to curse them. Perhaps then I shall be able to defeat them and drive them out. The irony is immediate. Pharaoh had once tried to control Israel through forced labor and violence. Now another king feared the same people because of what had happened since they left Egypt. But the conflict involving Balaam would not unfold as Balak expected. Balaam sought divine guidance. He was told not to go with the messengers and not to curse Israel because the people were blessed.
So Balaam initially refused. Balak sent more prestigious officials and offered greater honor. Balaam answered that even if Balak gave him a house full of silver and gold, he could not go beyond what God permitted. Yet the story remained complicated. Balaam eventually went, but only under strict limitation. He could speak only what God gave him. On the journey, one of the strangest scenes in the wilderness narrative occurred. Balaam rode on his donkey. An angel of the Lord stood in the road with a drawn sword. Balaam did not see the angel. The donkey did. The animal turned aside. Balaam struck it. Later, the donkey pressed against a wall, crushing Balaam's foot. He struck it again. Finally, when there was nowhere to turn, the donkey lay down. Balaam struck it a third time. Then the animal spoke. The scene reverses expected perception. The famous seer could not see what his donkey saw. The man hired because of spiritual reputation had to be stopped by the animal beneath him. Then Balaam's eyes were opened. He saw the angel standing in the road. He bowed down. The message was clear. Balaam was not free to manipulate Israel's future for payment or political advantage. He could go forward only under divine restriction. When he finally arrived, Balak took him to places from which Israel could be seen. Altars were built. Sacrifices were offered. Balak waited for a curse. Instead, Balaam blessed Israel. Balak was furious. He had hired a man to weaken his enemies, but the words moving through Balaam's mouth did the opposite. Balak tried again from another location. Again, Balaam could not curse. A third attempt followed. Still, the blessing continued. The king's strategy was collapsing in front of him. One of Balaam's oracles included language that would echo far beyond this moment. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Readers across different traditions have discussed the full prophetic scope of these words. At the immediate level, the oracle announced the future strength and rule associated with Israel. Later biblical and Jewish interpretation would hear wider significance in the imagery. But within Moses' story, one point is already obvious. A foreign king had hired a prophet to curse Israel. The curse could not be spoken. The people were protected from an attack they were not even fully aware was happening. Yet the next danger would show that external protection did not make Israel invulnerable. Because what could not be achieved through a curse could still be threatened through compromise. Israel remained in the region of Shittim. There the people began engaging in sexual immorality with Moabite women. They were invited to sacrifices offered to local gods. They ate. They bowed down. Israel became joined to Baal of Peor. The pattern from Sinai returned in another form. The people who could not be cursed by Balaam could still turn themselves toward idolatry. Judgment broke out. A plague spread through the camp. Moses ordered action against those involved. Then in the middle of the crisis, an Israelite man publicly brought a Midianite woman into the camp before Moses and the congregation. Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, responded decisively. The public defiance was stopped, and the plague came to an end. The number who died was severe. Once again, Israel's greatest danger had not been an enemy army outside the camp. It had been unfaithfulness within. This contrast is one of the strongest themes in the wilderness story. Sihon could be defeated. Og could be defeated. Balak's curse could be overturned. But no military victory could substitute for covenant faithfulness. An external enemy might attack Israel. Internal rebellion could destroy them from the inside. After the crisis at Peor, another census was taken. This was more than an administrative act. It revealed that the generation counted near Sinai was essentially gone. A new generation stood in its place. Among the older generation, Joshua and Caleb remained as living reminders of the day Israel had refused to enter the land. The children had become adults. The future that their parents feared for them had arrived.
Now land inheritance began to be discussed in practical terms.
The daughters of Zelophehad came before Moses because their father had died without sons. They asked why his name should disappear from his clan merely because he had no male heir. Moses brought the matter before God. Their claim was upheld. They were to receive an inheritance. The ruling also established broader principles for inheritance. This may seem like a quiet legal episode compared with seas opening or armies falling,
but it signals how close Israel had come to entering the land. People were no longer merely asking where the next water source would be. They were thinking about inheritance, family continuity, property, the shape of life after the wilderness. Then God told Moses to climb the heights of Abarim and look toward the land. After he saw it, he would be gathered to his people as Aaron had been. The announcement brought Moses face to face again with his approaching death. But his response did not center first on himself. He asked God to appoint a leader over the congregation, someone who could go out before them, someone who could come in before them, someone who could lead them out and bring them in. Moses did not want the people to become like sheep without a shepherd. It was a fitting concern from a man who had spent years tending sheep before being called to lead Israel. God named Joshua. Joshua already had a long history with Moses. He had led Israel in battle against Amalek. He had accompanied Moses on the mountain. He had remained near the tent of meeting. He had entered Canaan as one of the 12 spies. And unlike the 10 who spread fear, he had stood with Caleb and urged Israel to trust God. Now his role changed. Moses brought Joshua before Eleazar the priest and the congregation. He laid his hands on him. Authority began to pass publicly from one leader to the next. The moment carried enormous emotional weight, even if the biblical text describes it without sentimentality. Moses had spent decades carrying the burden of Israel. Now he was beginning to prepare for the day when he would no longer carry it. Joshua would not become a second Moses in every sense. The biblical tradition would continue to speak of Moses' role as unique. But Joshua would be the man who completed the crossing Moses could not. Before that transition was finished, Israel still had unresolved conflict with Midian. Moses was instructed to take vengeance on the Midianites connected with the events that had drawn Israel into sin. A force was sent into battle. The campaign ended in Israelite victory, though the account also raises difficult questions about ancient warfare and judgment that should not be reduced to simplistic slogans. Within the narrative, the war is directly connected to the crisis at Peor. The point is not that Israel was being invited into unrestricted violence. It is that the seduction that had nearly devastated the camp was treated as a serious covenant threat. Among those killed was Balaam. The man who had been unable to curse Israel directly came to be connected with the strategy that led Israel toward corruption. His story ended far from the prestige Balak had once promised him. Then another issue emerged. The tribes of Reuben and Gad possessed large herds. When they saw the land east of the Jordan territory already conquered from Sihon and Og, they recognized that it was suitable for livestock. They asked Moses if they could receive their inheritance there rather than crossing the Jordan. Moses reacted strongly. The request sounded dangerously familiar. "Shall your brothers go to war while you sit here?" he reminded them of the spies. Their fathers had discouraged Israel from entering Canaan. The result had been 40 years of wandering. Moses feared that another refusal was taking shape at the border. Reuben and Gad clarified their intention. They would build settlements for their families and places for their livestock. But their fighting men would cross the Jordan with the other tribes. They would not return to their own inheritance until the rest of Israel had received theirs. With that commitment, the arrangement was accepted.
Half the tribe of Manasseh also received territory east of the Jordan. The episode reveals how deeply Moses had been shaped by the failure at Kadesh. He would not allow the new generation casually to repeat the old rebellion. The past had to become instruction, not destiny. Then Israel was commanded to record the stages of its journey from Egypt. Place after place, camp after camp, from Ramses to Succoth, from the departure after Passover through the wilderness, from the Red Sea toward Sinai, from Sinai through years of wandering toward the plains of Moab. The list can feel repetitive when read quickly, but it carries enormous narrative force. Every location represents survival. Every stage says they kept moving. Egypt did not reclaim them. The wilderness did not erase them. Rebellion did not end the promise. A generation died. Another generation arrived. Now Israel camped on the plains of Moab by the Jordan opposite Jericho. Jericho. For the first time, the name of a city inside the Promised Land stood directly before them. The destination was no longer a distant idea, it was across the river. God gave instructions concerning boundaries, inheritance cities for the Levites, and cities of refuge. Again, the laws assumed a future beyond wandering. Israel was preparing to live as a settled people. But before they crossed, Moses had to speak. The book of Deuteronomy opens with Israel east of the Jordan. Moses began addressing the new generation. His task was not simply to repeat every law word for word. He would interpret their history. He would remind them where they had failed. He would explain why covenant faithfulness mattered. He would warn them against forgetting God once they lived in houses they had not built and ate from fields they had not planted. The old man standing before them was one of the few people alive who could personally remember nearly every major stage of the story. He remembered Pharaoh's Egypt. He remembered the night of departure. He remembered the Red Sea. He remembered Sinai. He remembered the golden calf. He remembered the spies. He remembered Korah. He remembered the graves scattered across the wilderness. He remembered Meribah, and he knew that people who forget their history often repeat it. Moses began near the failure at Kadesh. He reminded the people that God had told Israel to go up and take possession of the land. Their fathers had demanded spies. The spies had returned. The people had become afraid. They grumbled. They claimed God hated them and had brought them out to destroy them. Moses reminded the new generation how irrational that accusation had been. God had carried them through the wilderness as a father carries his son. Yet they had refused to trust. Now the children of that generation stood exactly where their parents had been unable to stand faithfully. This was the turning point. Not because the new generation was automatically better. They too had sinned. They too had complained. They too needed warning. But they were being given the opportunity their parents had thrown away. Moses reviewed the victories over Sihon and Og. Those victories were not merely history lessons, they were evidence. If God had already given them powerful kingdoms east of the Jordan, they did not need to face Canaan as though they had never seen his power. Then Moses spoke directly to Joshua. Your own eyes have seen all that the Lord your God has done to these two kings. The same would be done to the kingdoms ahead. Joshua was not being asked to lead on the basis of theory. He had evidence behind him. Moses told him not to fear. God would fight for Israel. But then Moses revealed another moment from his own struggle. He had pleaded with God to let him cross the Jordan. He wanted to see the good land. He wanted to see Lebanon. He wanted to finish the journey. Yet the answer remained no. Moses would go up to a high place and look, but Joshua would cross. Encourage him, strengthen him. Moses had to build up the man who would do what Moses himself was forbidden to do. That is one of the most difficult forms of leadership. to prepare someone else to complete what you began. Moses could have resented Joshua.
The text gives no indication that he did. Instead, he strengthened him.
The mission mattered more than Moses' personal role in its final stage. Then the tone of Deuteronomy became urgent. Israel must listen. They must not add to or subtract from the commandments. They must remember what they had seen. They must teach their children. They must never forget the day at Horeb. Moses warned especially about idolatry. Israel had heard God's voice, but had seen no form that could be reduced to an image. They were not to corrupt themselves by making idols. Moses knew how quickly that could happen. He had watched the golden calf being worshipped beneath Sinai. He knew that the temptation of Canaan would not come only through armies. It would come through gods, altars, images, marriage alliances, prosperity, comfort. The wilderness had been harsh. The land would bring another danger, ease. Moses repeated the 10 Commandments for the new generation.
The words first heard at Sinai were now placed before people who had been children or not yet born when the covenant was first declared. Then came one of the defining statements of Israel's faith. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Israel was commanded to love the Lord with all the heart, soul, and strength. These words were to be kept close, taught to children, discussed at home, spoken while traveling, remembered in daily life. The covenant was not meant to remain only in sacred gatherings. It had to enter ordinary life. Moses then warned them about prosperity. Soon they would enter cities they had not built, houses filled with goods they had not produced, wells they had not dug, vineyards and olive trees they had not planted. They would eat and be satisfied, and that was when forgetting could begin. This warning might have sounded strange after 40 years in the wilderness. How could abundance be dangerous? Because deprivation makes dependence obvious. Prosperity can hide it. In the wilderness, Israel woke every morning and gathered manna. In Canaan, harvests could create the illusion of self-sufficiency. Moses warned them, "Do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt." The Exodus had to remain at the center of their identity, even after Egypt was far behind them. When their children asked what the commandments meant, they were to answer with a story. "We were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt. The Lord brought us out." The law was to be understood in the context of rescue. Memory would become a defense against rebellion. Moses also made clear that Israel had not been chosen because it was the largest or strongest nation. The story itself disproved any such pride. They had been slaves. They had been afraid. They had rebelled repeatedly. Their existence depended on covenant faithfulness and divine mercy. Neither their future military strength nor their possession of land could become grounds for arrogance. And Moses knew something else. Entering the land would not automatically solve the deeper problem. A geographical border cannot transform the human heart. The generation that entered Canaan would still face the choice between obedience and rebellion. So the words of Moses increasingly moved beyond territory. He spoke about the heart. Israel needed to love God, fear God, serve God, turn away from stubbornness. Later he would speak of a future work of God described as circumcision of the heart language that pointed beyond external identity toward inward faithfulness. The wilderness had taught Moses that laws could be written on tablets while people still built a calf below the mountain. The new generation needed more than possession. They needed fidelity. As Moses continued speaking, the plains of Moab became something like a vast classroom. The Jordan lay nearby. Beyond it stood the land. Joshua waited. The tribes listened. And an elderly prophet who knew he would not cross the river poured decades of failure, victory, warning, and hope into his final instructions. Moses' work was changing.
For most of his life, he had led Israel by going ahead. Now he had to lead them by preparing to leave. The battles east of the Jordan had opened a path. Balak's curse had failed. The crisis at Peor had been judged. A new census had confirmed a new generation. Joshua had been appointed. Land east of the river had been assigned. The history had been reviewed. The commandments had been repeated. Israel was closer to Canaan than it had ever been. But Moses was not finished speaking, because before Joshua could lead Israel into battle, Moses wanted the people to understand the choice before them. It was larger than conquest, larger than borders, larger than cities. Israel could possess the land and still lose the purpose for which it had been given. So Moses would place before them two ways, life and death, blessing and curse, faithfulness and rebellion. And after 40 years of watching an entire generation perish because it refused to believe, Moses would make one final appeal: choose life. Moses had spent most of his life moving forward, from Egypt to Midian, from Midian back to Egypt, from Egypt to the Red Sea, from the sea to Sinai, from Sinai into the wilderness, from the wilderness toward the Jordan. Now for the first time he had reached the point where forward movement would continue without him. Israel stood on the plains of Moab east of the Jordan River. Across the water lay Canaan. The destination that had shaped decades of wandering was finally visible. But Moses knew something the people could not ignore. Crossing a river would be easier than keeping a covenant. Conquering fortified cities would be easier than conquering the habits of fear, pride, compromise, and forgetfulness that had destroyed the previous generation. So before Israel crossed, Moses kept speaking. The book of Deuteronomy preserves these final addresses as more than a farewell speech. They are the words of a leader who had watched nearly every kind of failure a community could experience. He had seen slavery, fear, idolatry, rebellion, false memory, political challenge, religious compromise, presumption, sexual immorality, and unbelief. He had also seen mercy, provision, covenant restoration, victory, forgiveness, and generation after generation preserved when the story could easily have ended. Now Moses placed the future before the people in unmistakable terms. If they obeyed, there would be blessing. If they rejected the covenant, there would be consequences. The land itself would not protect them from rebellion. That was one of the hardest truths Moses had learned. Israel had once assumed that leaving Egypt would solve everything. It had not. They had once assumed that reaching Sinai would establish permanent faithfulness. It had not. They might now be tempted to assume that entering Canaan would secure their future automatically. It would not. A promised land did not eliminate moral responsibility. Moses began reviewing the commands that would shape life after the wilderness. Worship had to remain centered on the God who had delivered them. Israel was not to imitate the religious practices of the nations around them. They were not to create competing altars wherever they wished. They were not to worship other gods merely because surrounding cultures did. Moses warned them that false prophets could arise. Signs alone would not be enough to prove a message true if that message led Israel away from the Lord. That warning was significant after the wilderness. Israel had seen extraordinary signs. But Moses wanted the new generation to understand that faithfulness was not built on fascination with wonders. It was built on loyalty to the God who had revealed himself and entered covenant with them. Moses also addressed justice. Judges were to be appointed. They were not to distort justice. They were not to show partiality. They were not to accept bribes. Future kings were warned against multiplying horses, wives, and wealth. The king himself would not stand above the covenant. He would be expected to know the law and live under it. That principle carried enormous significance for Israel's future. The nation had escaped a Pharaoh whose will functioned as absolute authority. Israel was not being delivered from one form of tyranny merely to create another. Its leaders were accountable, its judges were accountable, its priests were accountable, and Moses himself had already learned that no calling placed a person beyond judgment. The memory of Meribah stood behind every word. Moses also spoke about priests and Levites, about prophets, about warfare, about cities of refuge, about family life, about property, about care for the vulnerable. The laws formed a vision of a society in which worship, justice, memory, and daily life could not be separated. Then Moses spoke of something that looked far beyond the immediate crossing of the Jordan.
He warned that if Israel eventually became corrupt and turned to idols, the people could lose the land. They could be scattered among the nations. The warning was severe, but even there Moses did not end with destruction. He spoke of return. If Israel sought God again with all their heart and soul, they would find him. The covenant story contained judgment, but also mercy. Moses had seen that pattern throughout his life. Israel had broken covenant at the golden calf, yet the tablets had been renewed. They had rebelled at Kadesh, yet their children were still standing at the border. They had sinned at Peor, yet the nation had not been erased. Again and again, judgment had been real. Again and again, mercy had prevented failure from becoming the final word. Then Moses returned to the most intimate issue of all, the heart. He told Israel that external signs of covenant identity were not enough if the people remained stubborn inside. Circumcise your hearts, he told them. Do not be stiff-necked any longer. This language would become important later in Scripture because it named the problem the wilderness had revealed repeatedly. Israel did not lack information. They had heard the commandments. They did not lack miracles. They had seen Egypt judged. They did not lack leadership. Moses had guided them for decades. The deeper problem was that the human heart could resist even overwhelming evidence. Moses knew this because he had watched an entire generation do exactly that. And he knew something else. He himself was not exempt. The wilderness had not merely exposed Israel. It had exposed him. His anger had consequences. His failure at Meribah remained part of the story. So when Moses told the people not to trust themselves, he was not speaking as a man who had never failed. He spoke as someone who understood how quickly one moment of disobedience could shape the rest of a life. Then Moses turned to Joshua. Again and again he strengthened him. The future leader needed courage. Canaan contained fortified cities, powerful enemies, unfamiliar terrain, and a population whose faithfulness could not be taken for granted. Joshua would have to lead people who had inherited both promise and history. He had to remember what happened when fear controlled the spies. He had to remember what happened when rebellion challenged authority. He had to remember that military victory never replaced covenant obedience. Moses had carried these lessons at great cost. Joshua would inherit them. Then came one of the most important covenant ceremonies Moses commanded. Once Israel entered the land, blessings and curses were to be proclaimed from Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. The law was to be written publicly. The people were to remember that possession of the land came with responsibility. This was not simply a military occupation. It was covenant life. Moses described blessings associated with obedience. Blessing in cities, blessing in fields, fruitfulness, security, victory over enemies, provision. But he also described curses associated with rebellion, disease, defeat, famine, confusion, exile.
The language becomes severe because Moses wanted Israel to understand that covenant betrayal was not a minor mistake. It could unravel the life of the nation. The people who had once been removed from one land could be removed from another. The same God who gave inheritance remained holy after inheritance was received. Then the warning became almost prophetic in its sweep.
Moses described Israel's scattering among nations. He described distress. He described the loss of land. He described conditions that later generations would recognize with painful familiarity. But again, judgment was not the only horizon. Moses spoke of restoration. When Israel returned to God, God would gather them. He would restore them. He would do something deeper than simply return them geographically. He would circumcise their hearts so that they could love Him. This was a profound shift. The covenant problem had always seemed to be Israel's repeated inability to remain faithful. Moses now pointed toward divine action at the level of the heart itself. The same story that began with liberation from an external Pharaoh was now pointing toward the need for inward transformation. Then Moses told Israel that the commandment was not too mysterious or too distant. They did not need someone to ascend into heaven to retrieve it. They did not need someone to cross the sea to bring it near. The word had been placed before them, near them, in their mouth and heart. Then Moses reached the moment that summarized his final appeal. "See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil." The language was stark because the choice was serious. If Israel loved God, walked in His ways, and kept the covenant, they would live. If their hearts turned away and they bowed to other gods, destruction would follow. Then Moses called heaven and earth as witnesses. "I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse." Then came the appeal that carried the weight of 40 years. Choose life. Moses had seen what choosing fear had done. He had seen men who survived Pharaoh die in a wilderness they could have crossed. He had seen people choose an idol while standing beneath a mountain filled with divine glory. He had seen leaders choose pride. He had seen an entire generation choose retreat at the border. Now he told their children, choose differently, choose life, not merely for yourselves, for your descendants. Love the Lord, obey His voice, hold fast to Him. Moses' mission had begun with the words, "Let my people go." Now it was ending with another command, live faithfully once you are free. Freedom without faithfulness could reproduce the same destruction under different circumstances. Then God told Moses that the day of his death was drawing near. Moses and Joshua were called to the tent of meeting. The transition of leadership was entering its final stage. God told Moses that after his death, Israel would eventually turn toward other gods. The warning was devastating. Moses had spent his life teaching them. The future included rebellion anyway. This did not mean his work had been pointless. It meant covenant faithfulness could not be guaranteed by one great leader. Moses could teach, warn, intercede, write, model, discipline, but he could not permanently transform every heart. So a song was given as a witness against Israel. Moses was to teach it to the people. The song would preserve memory. Long after Moses died, the words could confront future generations. The Song of Moses begins by calling heaven and earth to listen. It describes God as the rock. His work is perfect. His ways are just, faithful, without injustice. Then it contrasts divine faithfulness with human corruption. Israel had been found and cared for, protected, guided, fed. Yet prosperity could lead to abandonment. The people could forget the God who made them. They could turn to other gods. Judgment would follow. But even the song of warning did not end in complete abandonment.
God would vindicate his people. He would show compassion when their strength was gone. Again the same tension returned: faithfulness, rebellion, judgment, mercy. Moses spoke the words of the song in the hearing of Israel. Then he gave one more warning. These words were not empty. They are your life. The law was not merely a national document. It was meant to shape whether Israel flourished or collapsed. Then came the command Moses knew was coming. Go up into the mountain, Mount Nebo. Look at the land of Canaan. Then die. The reason was repeated. Moses and Aaron had broken faith at Meribah. They had not upheld God's holiness before Israel. Moses would see the land. He would not enter. But before the final ascent, one more major act remained. Moses blessed the tribes. Just as Jacob had spoken over his sons before his death, Moses now spoke over Israel. The blessings reflected tribal identities, future roles, and hopes. He began by describing God's appearance from Sinai in majestic language. Then, tribe by tribe, Moses spoke. Reuben, Judah, Levi, Benjamin, Joseph, Zebulun, Issachar, Gad, Dan, Naphtali, Asher. The words were not identical in length or emphasis. Some focused on survival, some on strength, some on priestly service, some on territory and abundance. But taken together, they sounded like the final words of a shepherd looking over the flock he had carried for most of his adult life. Moses had begun his leadership deeply uncertain that anyone would listen to him. Now his final words were being preserved for generations. But before Moses climbed the mountain, Israel still faced another difficult moment. The transition to Joshua had to be made public and unmistakable. Moses called Joshua before the people. Be strong and courageous. Israel would cross the Jordan. Joshua would lead them. He must not fear. God would go ahead. He would not abandon them. The words were not merely encouragement. They were a transfer of responsibility. Moses had once been told at the burning bush, I will be with you. Now, near the end of Moses' life, Joshua received the same foundational assurance. Leadership would change. The presence behind the mission would not. Moses also entrusted the law to the priests and elders. It was to be read publicly at regular intervals so that men, women, children, and foreigners living among Israel could hear and learn. The future could not depend on personal memory of Moses. Most of the next generation would never hear his voice directly. The covenant had to survive the death of the leader. That required teaching, reading, remembering, passing the story forward. Moses had learned something crucial over 40 years of that. A miracle can liberate one generation. Only faithful transmission can prepare the next. Then the text describes Moses writing down the words of the law. The scroll was to be placed beside the Ark of the Covenant as a witness. Moses summoned the elders and officers. He warned them again. He knew their tendency toward rebellion. He had seen it while alive. He feared what might happen after his death. The speech could sound pessimistic, but Moses was not surrendering. He was doing the final work of a leader who understood that truth must be spoken, even when future failure is possible. Leadership is not proven by guaranteeing that everyone will obey. It is proven by faithfulness to the responsibility entrusted. Then another memory from Israel's past became relevant. Moses had spent his life standing between generations. He belonged to the Exodus generation, yet he would die with the generation that entered Canaan standing around him. He was the bridge between slavery and settlement, between Egypt and inheritance, between Pharaoh and Joshua, between Sinai and the Jordan. He had become the human link holding together two eras. But bridges are crossed. They are not destinations. Moses' role was almost complete. Israel moved closer to the Jordan. The river marked more than geography. On one side stood 40 years of wandering. On the other stood the land promised to Abraham. For Joshua and the people, the river represented beginning. For Moses, it represented limit. He could walk to its edge. He could see beyond it. He could describe the future. But he could not cross. This tension gives the final chapter of Moses' life much of its emotional force. His mission was successful and incomplete. He delivered Israel from Egypt, but he would not lead them into Canaan. He gave the covenant, but he could not guarantee their future obedience. He appointed Joshua, but he would not witness the conquest. He taught a generation how to live, but he knew later generations might forget. Moses had to accept a truth every leader eventually faces. The work is larger than the worker. Israel's future could not end when his life ended. That was why Joshua mattered. That was why the law had been written. That was why the song had been taught. That was why the blessings had been spoken.
Moses was preparing Israel to continue without depending on his physical presence. And yet before he died, God allowed him one final view. Not yet. First, the people would have to stand together. The covenant would be renewed. The choice would be stated. Joshua would be commissioned. The final warnings would be given. And Moses would speak words that carried almost unbearable simplicity. I am 120 years old today. I am no longer able to go out and come in. The Lord has said to me, you shall not cross this Jordan. The man who had once refused to go back to Egypt now wanted to go farther than he was permitted. The man who had said, send someone else, at the burning bush, had spent 40 years refusing to abandon a people who repeatedly wanted to abandon the journey. The shepherd had become the prophet. The fugitive had become the mediator. The reluctant speaker had become the voice of the covenant, and now the final test of Moses was no longer whether he would confront Pharaoh. It was whether he could release the mission into someone else's hands. Joshua stood before him. The Jordan waited, and beyond it rose the land Moses had carried in his heart for decades. He could not cross, but he could still prepare the man who would. The wilderness years had been long, the rebellions had been costly, the old generation had fallen, and now the people of Israel stood near the Jordan with one reality before them. The next chapter would begin without Moses. For decades, Moses had been the visible center of the nation's journey. He had spoken before Pharaoh lifted his staff over the sea, climbed Sinai, interceded after rebellion, judged disputes, appointed leaders, endured complaints, and carried the burden of a people who often resisted the very future they had prayed to receive. But leadership was now passing to Joshua. That transition was not a minor administrative detail. It was one of the final great acts of Moses' life. Moses had to prepare Israel to trust God without confusing faithfulness to God with dependence on one human leader. That distinction mattered because Moses' presence had become woven into almost every major memory of the Exodus. When the Nile turned to blood, Moses was there. When Pharaoh resisted, Moses was there. When the sea opened, Moses stood before it. When Sinai burned, Moses climbed the mountain. When the people rebelled, Moses interceded. When judgment threatened, Moses repeatedly stood in the breach. Yet the covenant had never belonged to Moses. The promise had never begun with Moses. It had begun generations earlier with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it would continue after Moses was gone. That was the truth Joshua now had to embody. Moses called the people together. He spoke openly about his age. He was 120 years old. He told them that he would no longer be the one going out and coming in before them, and he reminded them again that God had told him he would not cross the Jordan. Then he shifted attention away from his own limitation. The Lord would cross before them. The nations ahead would be defeated.
Joshua would cross at their head. Moses pointed back to Sihon and Og, the kings already defeated east of the Jordan. Those victories were evidence. Israel was not being asked to move into an unknown future without any reason for confidence. They had already seen powerful kingdoms fall. They had already seen what happened when God went before them. Then Moses spoke words that would become inseparable from Joshua's calling. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear. Do not be terrified. God would go with them. He would not leave them. He would not abandon them. Then Moses called Joshua forward in the sight of all Israel. This mattered. The new leader could not be appointed only in a private conversation. Israel needed to see the transition. Joshua needed to hear the commission publicly. Moses repeated the command, "Be strong and courageous." Joshua would bring the people into the land promised to their fathers. He would oversee the distribution of their inheritance. The same people who had once asked, "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" now watched Moses transfer authority to the next leader. Moses' leadership was ending, not in chaos, but in succession. And yet, Moses understood that Joshua alone could not protect Israel from future rebellion. The covenant had to be remembered after both Moses and Joshua were gone. So the law was entrusted to the priests and elders. At the end of every 7 years during the Feast of Booths, the law was to be read publicly. Men would hear it, women would hear it, children would hear it, foreigners living among Israel would hear it. The purpose was clear. Each generation had to learn to fear the Lord and follow the covenant. Children who had not personally seen Egypt still needed to know Egypt. Children who had not stood at Sinai still needed to hear Sinai. Children who had never crossed the wilderness still needed to understand what the wilderness had revealed. Memory had to outlive eyewitnesses. That is one of the most important developments in the final phase of Moses' story. For much of the Exodus, Israel learned through events. They saw, they suffered, they experienced. Now, Moses was preparing them to learn through transmission. Tell the story, read the law, teach the children, remember. Because eventually, no one alive would remember the night of Passover firsthand. Eventually, no one would be able to say, "I personally saw the sea divide." Yet the identity of Israel could not depend on eyewitness memory alone. The covenant story had to be carried forward in words. Then Moses and Joshua went to the tent of meeting. The pillar of cloud appeared. There Moses received one of the most sobering revelations of his final days. Israel would eventually turn away. After Moses' death, the people would pursue other gods. They would break covenant. Judgment would follow. The future Moses had spent decades preparing would still contain rebellion. This might sound like defeat, but the biblical narrative does not present Moses' work as wasted. Instead, it reveals the limits of leadership. A prophet can teach truth. A leader can establish structures. A lawgiver can write commands. A mediator can intercede. But none of these can mechanically guarantee the faithfulness of future generations. The covenant required continual response. So Moses was commanded to teach Israel a song. The song would function as a witness. Songs can travel through generations in ways speeches sometimes cannot. They can be remembered after circumstances change. They can be sung by people who did not witness the events they describe. The Song of Moses begins by calling heaven and earth to listen. Moses described his teaching like rain falling upon grass. Then he proclaimed the greatness of God. The rock's work is perfect. God was faithful, just, upright. The problem was not failure on God's side. The song then turned toward Israel. God had found the people in a wilderness. He had surrounded them, protected them, cared for them. Like an eagle watching over its young, God had carried them. The imagery deliberately recalled the wilderness journey. Israel's survival had never been accidental. Then the tone changed. Prosperity could produce rebellion. Israel could grow satisfied.
And in satisfaction, they could forget the one who had given them everything. They could sacrifice to other gods. They could abandon the rock who gave them life. The song warned of judgment, but it also made clear that other nations were not ultimately sovereign over Israel. Even when foreign powers became instruments of discipline, God remained judge. The song moved toward vindication and mercy. The people could fall terribly, but their failure would not make the God of the covenant unfaithful. Moses taught the song to Israel. Then he told the people to take its words seriously. They were not empty words. They were their life. Everything Moses had learned over the previous 40 years seemed compressed into that warning. The people had repeatedly treated words as though they were temporary. At Sinai they said they would obey. Then they built a calf. At Kadesh they were told to enter. They refused. After judgment was announced, they were told not to go. Then they went. Words mattered. Commands mattered. Promises mattered. The future of Israel depended on whether they treated the covenant as life or as background noise. Then Moses was told again to prepare for death. He would ascend Mount Nebo. From there he would see Canaan. He would die outside the land because of what happened at Meribah. The sentence had not changed. The great prophet who had interceded for Israel over and over could not negotiate away his own consequence. This gave his final blessing even greater weight. Moses stood before the tribes of Israel as a man who knew he was speaking near the end. His blessing began with the majesty of God. Then he turned from tribe to tribe. To Reuben he spoke of survival. For Judah he prayed that his voice would be heard and that help would come against enemies. Levi received words connected with priestly faithfulness and the teaching of the law. Benjamin was described with the imagery of beloved security. Joseph received a long blessing associated with abundance, strength, and the favor of the one who appeared in the bush. Zebulun and Issachar were addressed together. Gad was associated with strength, Dan with the imagery of a lion, Naphtali with favor, Asher with blessing and strength. The details reflected tribal identity and future hope, but the closing words moved beyond any single tribe. There is none like God. Moses described God as the one who rides through the heavens to help his people. Then came a line that captured the security Israel needed to remember after Moses was gone. The eternal God is your dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms. Israel's security had never ultimately been Moses. Moses would die. God would remain. The blessing closed with Israel described as a people saved by the Lord. Their future was not supposed to be built on the memory of one extraordinary human leader. It was supposed to be built on the faithfulness of the God who had delivered them. Now Moses' public work was almost complete. But before he climbed Nebo, the narrative forces us to look back at the extraordinary path that had brought him here. He had been born under a decree of death. He had been drawn from the Nile, raised in Pharaoh's household, driven into exile, called from a burning bush, sent back to the kingdom he feared, rejected by Pharaoh, questioned by Israel, vindicated through signs, present at Passover, standing at the sea, speaking at Sinai, breaking the tablets, interceding for rebels, leading through hunger and thirst, watching a generation refuse the land, enduring Korah's rebellion, losing Miriam, losing Aaron, failing at Meribah, watching the children of the Exodus generation rise around him. And now he was preparing to die while the promise continued. But there was still a final tension in the nation. Joshua had been appointed. The people had been warned. The law had been given. Yet Israel had not crossed the Jordan.
They stood close enough to see the destination, but not yet inside it.
For the new generation, the greatest military challenge still lay ahead. Jericho, the fortified cities, the Canaanite kings, the division of territory. All of that would belong to Joshua's chapter. But Moses' final contribution was not military strategy. It was memory. Remember Egypt, remember Sinai, remember the wilderness, remember the covenant, remember what happened when your fathers were afraid. Remember what happened when they worshipped an idol. Remember what happened when they accused God of bringing them out to die. Remember what happened when leaders sought power for themselves. Remember what happened when I myself failed to uphold God as holy. Do not imagine that the past belongs only to the dead. The past is instruction for the living. Then Moses gave the people perhaps the most important political and spiritual warning they would carry into the land. Do not say that your power created your success. When you enter good land, when you build houses, when your herds multiply, when silver and gold increase, when life becomes comfortable, do not say in your heart, "My power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth." Remember the Lord. The wilderness generation had struggled with scarcity. The next generation would have to survive abundance. That may sound like the easier test. Moses did not believe it was. Hunger made Israel complain. Prosperity could make Israel forget. Both threatened covenant faithfulness. Moses warned them not to imagine that they were receiving the land because of their own righteousness. He had enough evidence to destroy that illusion. Israel had repeatedly been stubborn. The golden calf alone proved the point. Moses reminded them directly, "Remember and do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God to wrath in the wilderness." This was unusual national storytelling. Most nations prefer histories that exaggerate their virtue. Moses preserved Israel's failures, not to humiliate them endlessly, to keep pride from rewriting the story. They were not the heroes of the Exodus because they had been consistently faithful. They had been rescued because God was faithful to his covenant. Even Moses' own story reinforced that lesson. The great leader would not enter the land. No one could stand at the Jordan and say the promise depended on human perfection. Then Moses turned again to the theme of love. What did God require? Fear the Lord, walk in his ways, love him, serve him with heart and soul. Keep his commandments. The language was relational. Covenant faithfulness could not be reduced to outward performance while the heart belonged elsewhere. That had been the lesson of the golden calf. That had been the lesson of Baal Peor. That would remain the challenge in Canaan. Moses described the land itself in contrast with Egypt. Egypt depended heavily on the Nile and human systems of irrigation. Canaan was described as a land of hills and valleys drinking water from rain. The point was theological as much as geographical. Israel would have to recognize continued dependence on God. Entering the land did not mean graduating from trust. They would need rain, harvests, security, and covenant faithfulness. Then came the repeated command to teach children. Moses understood that the greatest long-term battle might not be against Canaanite armies. It might be against forgetting. A generation that remembers can make different choices. A generation that forgets may repeat the sins it inherited. So the words were to be spoken at home and on the road, at morning and evening, in ordinary life. The covenant had to become part of the rhythm of the household. Then Moses described one more future office. A prophet would arise from among Israel. The people were to listen. In its immediate context, the passage established the principle of prophetic leadership in Israel after Moses. The nation would not be left without divine instruction simply because Moses was gone. Later biblical interpretation would give this promise broader significance, but here
One point already stands clear. The death of Moses would not mean the silence of God. God could raise other servants, other prophets, other leaders. The mission would continue. Joshua represented the immediate succession in leadership. The prophetic promise pointed toward continued guidance. The written law preserved teaching. The priesthood preserved worship. The tribes carried inheritance. Moses had spent his final days building continuity into the nation. This is perhaps the hidden climax of his leadership. The younger Moses had tried to solve a crisis by himself. He killed an Egyptian. The older Moses prepared systems leaders, laws, songs, memories, priests and successors that could continue after he was gone. He had learned that a people cannot be carried forever by one man's strength. The future required something deeper. Then the final public moment came. Moses stood before Israel. Joshua stood nearby. The people knew the transition was real. Moses had no hidden plan to cross later. No final reversal had been announced. The Jordan would mark the boundary between his life and Joshua's leadership. Moses looked at the man who would finish the crossing, the same Joshua who had fought Amalek, the same Joshua who had climbed part of Sinai, the same Joshua who had entered Canaan 40 years earlier as a spy and returned saying Israel should trust God. Now he would return to that land not as a spy, but as commander. Moses told him again, "Be strong, be courageous, do not fear." The words carried echoes of everything the previous generation had failed to do. At Kadesh, fear had defeated them before battle began. Joshua had stood against that fear then. Now he would have to stand against it again. But Moses' emphasis remained the same. God goes before you. That was the heart of Moses' own story. At the burning bush, Moses had asked, "Who am I?" The answer had never been, "You are enough." The answer had been, "I will be with you." Now Joshua was being given the same foundation. Not confidence in Joshua alone, confidence in the presence of God. The handover was complete, and with that Moses reached the final threshold. There was nothing left to conquer for him, nothing left to negotiate with Pharaoh, no new generation left to count, no new successor to appoint. The prophet could now climb the mountain. But the final scene would not be merely a death scene. It would gather the entire story into one image. A man standing above the Jordan, looking across the land promised before his birth, a land he had spent 40 years approaching, a land he would never enter. From Mount Nebo, Moses would see the destination. Then the greatest leader of the Exodus generation would disappear from Israel's camp. No royal tomb, no monument built by his own command, no dynasty carrying his throne. Joshua would descend with the future. Moses would remain on the mountain, and the question that had followed him from Egypt would finally be answered. Was his life a failure because he did not cross the Jordan? Or had the mission always been larger than the man? The final chapter would decide how Scripture remembered Moses. Mount Nebo, the death of Moses and his legacy. Moses had spent 40 years leading Israel toward a land he would never enter. Now the journey had narrowed to a mountain. No army stood in his way. No Pharaoh waited inside a palace. No rebellious crowd demanded water. No brother stood beside him. No sister watched from the distance. The final obstacle was not political. It was not military. It was not even the wilderness. It was the word God had already spoken. Moses could see the promise. He could prepare others for the promise. He could bless the people who would inherit the promise, but he could not cross the Jordan with them. So Moses left the plains of Moab and climbed Mount Nebo. The book of Deuteronomy places him on the summit of Pisgah, opposite Jericho. Below him stretched the Jordan Valley. Beyond it lay the land that had shaped generations of covenant hope. From the mountain, God showed Moses the land: Gilead, Dan, the territory of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, Judah, the western sea, the Negev, the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. The description is not merely geographical. Each direction represented fulfillment. Long before Israel became a nation, Abraham had been told that his descendants would receive a land.
Isaac carried the same promise. Jacob carried it. Joseph died believing that God would eventually bring Israel out of Egypt and told his family to carry his bones with them when that day came. Moses had carried those bones out. Now he stood, looking across the same promised land. A promise that began before his birth had survived Pharaoh, slavery, rebellion, idolatry, unbelief, war, and wilderness. And now the promise stood before him. God told Moses that this was the land sworn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He was allowed to see it with his own eyes, but he would not cross over. There is something profoundly restrained about the way Scripture tells the moment. No long speech from Moses is recorded on the mountain. No final argument. No attempt to negotiate one more time. Earlier in Deuteronomy, Moses had already pleaded to enter. The answer had remained no. Now the prophet accepted the boundary, and there in the land of Moab, Moses died. He was 120 years old. Deuteronomy makes a point of saying that his eyesight had not become dim, and his natural strength had not departed. His death is therefore not presented simply as the collapse of a man physically exhausted beyond function. The story ends because his appointed time ends. His work is complete. The biblical text says that Moses was buried in a valley in Moab opposite Beth Peor. Yet no one knew the location of his grave. That detail separates Moses from many ancient rulers. There is no monumental tomb functioning as the center of his legacy. No pyramid, no royal burial complex, no shrine built around his body in the biblical account. The man raised in the world of Pharaoh died without a Pharaoh's monument. His memory would be carried not by a tomb, but by a story. Israel mourned Moses for 30 days. The wilderness generation had already lost Miriam. They had lost Aaron. Now Moses was gone. The 3 siblings whose lives had been intertwined with the Exodus were no longer in the camp. Miriam had watched over Moses at the Nile. Aaron had stood beside him before Pharaoh. Moses had led Israel from Egypt to the border of Canaan. Their chapter had ended. But Israel remained, and Joshua was ready. Deuteronomy says Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. Israel listened to Joshua. The transition Moses had prepared was functioning. The death of Moses did not create a leadership vacuum. That fact matters enormously. The mission survived the man. Israel's story did not stop because its greatest prophet died. The Jordan still waited. Jericho still stood beyond it. The inheritance still had to be received. Joshua would now lead the crossing. But before the biblical story moves fully into Joshua's era, Deuteronomy pauses to say something extraordinary about Moses. No prophet has risen in Israel like Moses. The text emphasizes the unique way the Lord knew him face to face. It remembers the signs and wonders performed in Egypt. It remembers the mighty power displayed before Pharaoh, his servants, and the entire land. It remembers the great deeds Moses carried out before Israel. This is the Bible's own final assessment of the man whose story began in such vulnerability. A child hidden under a death decree became the central human figure of the Exodus. A fugitive became a prophet. A shepherd became a national leader. A reluctant speaker became the mediator through whom Israel received covenant instruction.
But Scripture's praise of Moses does not erase his failures. That is one of the reasons his story carries such depth. The Bible remembers that he killed an Egyptian. It remembers his reluctance at the burning bush. It remembers his frustration. It remembers Meribah. It remembers that he died outside Canaan. His greatness does not require the removal of those facts. Instead, they reveal what the story was never about. It was never about human perfection.
Moses himself learned that truth repeatedly. When he asked, "Who am I?" God did not answer by telling him he was flawless. When Moses complained that he could not speak, God did not build the mission around eloquence. When Moses became overwhelmed by leadership, others were appointed to help. When Moses failed at Meribah, his role did not make him immune from consequence. And when Moses died, the covenant did not die with him. The story was larger than Moses from the beginning. That becomes even clearer when we look back at the entire arc of his life. Moses was born at a time when Pharaoh wanted Hebrew boys dead. His mother placed him in an ark among the reeds. He was drawn out by Pharaoh's daughter. He grew within the household of the very regime that oppressed his people. Then he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew and responded with violence. The act exposed his limits. He could kill one taskmaster. He could not free a nation. He fled. In Midian, Moses became a shepherd. For years, Egypt seemed distant. Then a burning bush pulled him back into the covenant story. He tried to refuse. "Who am I? What if they do not believe me? What if I cannot speak? Send someone else." Every objection was met, not with the claim that Moses was naturally extraordinary, but with the promise, "I will be with you." That became the foundation of everything that followed. Moses returned to Egypt. The first confrontation seemed to make Israel's suffering worse. Pharaoh increased their labor. The people blamed Moses, yet the conflict escalated. The Nile turned to blood. Frogs invaded the land. Gnats came, flies came, livestock died, boils spread, hail fell, locusts consumed what remained. Darkness covered Egypt. Then came Passover. The night when blood marked the houses of Israel and Egypt's firstborn died became the turning point. Pharaoh released the people. Then he pursued them. At the sea, Israel panicked. Moses told them to stand firm. The sea opened. Israel crossed. Egypt's forces were destroyed. It looked like the destination of the story, but it was only the end of one kind of slavery. The harder work had just begun. Egypt could be left in a night. The habits formed under Egypt would take much longer to confront. Israel complained about water, then food, then water again. At Sinai, the people entered covenant. They promised obedience. Then, while Moses was still on the mountain, they built the golden calf. The tablets shattered. Moses interceded. The covenant was renewed. The tabernacle was built. God's presence filled it. Again, the story seemed ready to move directly toward fulfillment. Then came Kadesh. 12 spies entered the land. 10 returned, controlled by fear. Joshua and Caleb urged faith. Israel refused. That decision changed the next 40 years. An entire generation would die in the wilderness. Moses had to lead people through the consequences of a decision he had pleaded with them not to make. Then Korah rebelled. Authority was challenged. Miriam died. At Meribah, Moses himself failed. Aaron died. Israel kept moving. The generation that had left Egypt disappeared. Their children stood in their place. Then the story turned again. Sihon fell. Og fell. Balak tried to curse Israel. The curse became blessing. Israel nevertheless fell into sin at Peor. Again, the greatest danger came not only from enemies outside, but from compromise inside. A new census was taken. Joshua was appointed.
land east of the Jordan began to be assigned. Moses delivered his final addresses. He told the people to remember.
That word may be the most important command of his last days. Remember. Remember Egypt. Remember slavery. Remember deliverance. Remember Sinai. Remember the wilderness. Remember your rebellion. Remember God's mercy. Remember that prosperity can be as dangerous as suffering if it causes you to forget. Moses knew that forgetting could destroy a nation long after an army failed to do so. And so the man who had spent decades creating movement finished his life creating memory. That memory would become central to Israel's identity. Generations later, Passover would still tell the story of Exodus. The law would still be read. Children would still ask what the commands meant. Parents would still answer by speaking about slavery and deliverance. Israel's calendar, worship law, songs, and national identity would carry the imprint of Moses' era. This is where Moses' legacy becomes much larger than one life. He was not merely the man who confronted Pharaoh. He became inseparable from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible in the traditional understanding of Israel. Biblical tradition strongly associates Moses with the law and with the foundational covenant instruction given to Israel. For generations, to speak of Moses could become a way of referring not only to the historical leader, but to the covenant instruction connected with him. His influence reached every area of Israelite life: worship, justice, purity, sacrifice, priesthood, festivals, food, family, leadership, property, care for the vulnerable, national memory. The Exodus gave Israel the story of rescue. Sinai gave Israel the structure of covenant life, and Moses stood at the center of both. Yet Moses was also remembered as an intercessor. Again and again, Israel's failures brought judgment near, and again, Moses stood between the people and destruction. After the golden calf, he pleaded for forgiveness. After the spies, he appealed to God's character and covenant reputation. During rebellion and plague, he interceded. Even when Aaron and Miriam challenged him, Moses prayed. The man who once reacted to injustice by killing an Egyptian gradually became the man who repeatedly responded to rebellion by standing in prayer. That development is one of the most important transformations in his life. The younger Moses wanted to act in his own strength. The older Moses had learned dependence. Not perfectly, but deeply. He knew by the end that Israel's survival had never rested on his power. That is why his final words pointed the people away from himself. Moses did not tell Israel, "Remember me because I saved you." He told them, "Remember the Lord who brought you out of Egypt." He did not present the law as proof of his own wisdom. He presented it as covenant instruction received from God. He did not tell Joshua to trust the reputation of Moses. He told him that God would go before him. The more important Moses became in Israel's history, the more important it was that he not become the center of worship. His unknown grave reinforces that distinction. Israel could honor his role, but the story did not end in a tomb cult around Moses. The covenant remained focused on God. Then there is the strange and powerful fact that Moses' story continues to echo long after Deuteronomy ends. The prophets repeatedly looked back to the Exodus. The Psalms retold it. Israel's later crises were often interpreted in light of the covenant established in Moses' generation. Kings were evaluated in relation to covenant faithfulness. Exile itself would later look like the fulfillment of warnings Moses had given before Israel entered the land. And restoration would be described in language that also echoed his promises about return mercy and the transformation of the heart. Moses' story became a framework through which later generations understood their own history. When Israel suffered, they remembered Egypt. When God delivered,
they remembered Exodus.
When they broke covenant, they remembered Sinai.
When prophets warned of judgment, the language of Moses' final speeches returned again. The wilderness was no longer merely a place on a map. It became a theological memory. It represented testing, dependence, provision, rebellion, and mercy. The figure of Moses also continues into the New Testament. And here we have to be precise. The New Testament does not erase the historical Moses or reduce him to a symbol. Instead, it looks back at his life while placing him within a larger biblical story.
The Gospel accounts present Moses as a foundational figure in Israel's scriptures. Jesus frequently speaks within a world shaped by the law of Moses, while also addressing how that law should be understood and fulfilled. At the Transfiguration, Moses appears with Elijah as Jesus is revealed in glory before Peter, James, and John. The scene is striking. Moses, who once asked to see God's glory and was given a protected revelation at Sinai, appears in a New Testament scene centered on the glory of Christ. Elijah represents another towering prophetic figure. Together, Moses and Elijah evoke the law and the prophets. Yet the focus of the scene does not remain on them. The disciples are directed toward Jesus. The biblical story continues beyond Moses. The Gospel of John also develops an important contrast. The law was given through Moses. Then it points to grace and truth coming through Jesus Christ. This does not portray Moses as an enemy of grace. Moses himself repeatedly experienced mercy. Rather, the passage places Moses within a sequence of redemptive history. His covenant role was foundational. It was not final. The book of Hebrews makes this distinction in another way. Moses is honored as faithful in God's house as a servant, but Christ is presented as son over the house. Moses remains great, yet the New Testament refuses to make him the final destination. That is consistent with Moses' own story. He was always leading toward something beyond himself, toward freedom, toward covenant, toward land, toward the future of Israel. Even his death at the border seems to embody this pattern. Moses reaches the edge. Then another must carry the people forward. There is also the matter of the Passover. The New Testament draws heavily on Passover imagery in its presentation of Jesus' death. Again, the connection should be made carefully. The original Passover had its own historical context in Egypt. It marked Israel's deliverance from judgment and slavery. Later Christian interpretation sees the themes of sacrifice and deliverance reaching a fuller theological expression in Christ. This is not achieved by pretending every small Exodus detail was a direct prediction. It is a larger biblical pattern. Deliverance, sacrifice, freedom, covenant. These themes that dominated Moses' life continue developing beyond him. The same is true of manna, water, the wilderness, the covenant, the mediator, the tabernacle. Later biblical texts return to these images because the Exodus became one of Scripture's great theological foundations. But Moses remains a historical human being inside that foundation, a man capable of courage and fear, faith and frustration, intercession and anger, strength and failure. That balance matters. Sometimes Moses is remembered only for the spectacular scenes, the staff, the plagues, the Red Sea, the tablets. But the quieter moments may reveal just as much. Moses listening to Jethro's advice because he could not judge every case alone. Moses falling face down during rebellion. Moses asking God not to abandon Israel. Moses praying for Miriam after she challenged him. Moses asking for a successor instead of making his final concern his own disappointment. Moses strengthening Joshua to complete the journey he wanted to complete himself. Those scenes reveal the cost of leadership. Moses was not simply a miracle worker.
He carried people, and people are heavier than staffs. He spent decades listening to complaints from those he had helped free. He watched them remember slavery fondly whenever the wilderness became uncomfortable. He stood between judgment and rebellion. He watched an entire generation disappear. Then he trained their children. That is why the final view from Nebo is so powerful. Moses looked across the land and saw not only geography, he saw everything the journey had cost, every confrontation with Pharaoh, every night of uncertainty, every burial in the wilderness, every intercession, every broken command, every restored promise, every mile. Then he died outside the destination. If the story were only about personal achievement, this would look like tragedy. If Moses' success were measured only by whether his own feet touched Canaan, his mission would seem unfinished. But Scripture measures the story differently. Israel stood ready to enter. Joshua had been appointed. The covenant had been taught. The law had been preserved. The tribes were prepared for inheritance. The promise continued. Moses had brought the people as far as he was appointed to bring them. That is not failure. It is completion within limits. There is a lesson here that extends beyond Moses without forcing his life into a simplistic moral formula. Faithfulness does not always mean seeing every promise completed within one lifetime. A person can carry a mission faithfully and still hand its final stage to another generation. Moses planted no permanent throne in Canaan. He built no dynasty there. He did something less visible and more enduring. He prepared a people to continue without him, and the Bible remembers him for it. His life also exposes one of Scripture's recurring themes. Great calling does not eliminate accountability. Moses had unique access to God. He performed extraordinary signs. He endured extraordinary burdens. Yet Meribah still mattered. The Bible did not conceal the consequence because Moses was important. That is significant. Scripture's heroes are not protected by propaganda. Abraham had weaknesses. Jacob had weaknesses. David would have weaknesses. Peter would have weaknesses. Moses had weaknesses. The biblical story repeatedly refuses to place ultimate hope in the moral perfection of its human leaders. That hope must rest elsewhere. Moses' legacy is therefore both enormous and limited. Enormous because few figures shaped Israel more deeply. Limited because Moses himself could not solve the deepest problem of the people he led. He could bring the law. He could not force obedience. He could reveal rebellion. He could not permanently remove it. He could intercede. He could not make future generations faithful. He could lead Israel out of Egypt. He could not take Egypt out of every heart. That is why his final speeches repeatedly return to inward transformation. Love God. Do not harden your heart. Do not forget. Choose life. The wilderness showed that external freedom without internal faithfulness could still lead to destruction. Israel needed more than a different geography. They needed a different orientation of the heart. That tension continues through the rest of the biblical story. Joshua would enter the land. Judges would rise. Kings would rule. Prophets would warn. Jerusalem would become central. The kingdom would divide. Exile would eventually come, and many of those later events would prove that Moses' warnings were not exaggerated. Israel could live in the land and still repeat the wilderness. They could possess cities and still forget. They could have kings and still rebel. The deeper issue followed them across the Jordan. But so did the promise. And this may be the most important truth connecting Moses' life from beginning to end. People repeatedly failed. The promise kept moving. Moses' parents lived under a death decree. The promise moved. Moses killed an Egyptian and fled. The promise moved. Pharaoh resisted. The promise moved. Israel panicked at the sea.
The promise moved. They built a golden calf. The promise moved. They refused Canaan. The promise moved. Moses failed at Meribah. The promise moved. He died outside the land. The promise still moved. Joshua would cross. The story would continue. That is why Moses' death is both an ending and a doorway. The man is gone. The mission continues. And there is one final image worth holding. At the beginning of Moses' life, someone else carried him toward an uncertain future. His mother placed him into a basket. His sister watched from the riverbank. Pharaoh's daughter drew him from the water. Moses survived because others acted before he was capable of acting for himself. At the end of his life, the pattern reverses. Moses is the one preparing others. He places the future into Joshua's hands. He teaches Israel what they must remember. He blesses them. He points them across the Jordan. Then he steps away from the story. The baby once carried through danger became the man who carried a nation through the wilderness. He did not enter the land, but he brought the people to its edge. And that is where Scripture leaves him. Not on a throne, not in a palace, not standing over Pharaoh, but on a mountain, looking at a promise larger than himself. The Nile had been behind him for a lifetime. The Jordan was below him. Egypt lay in the past. Canaan lay ahead. Between those waters stood one of the most extraordinary lives in the Bible. A life marked by rescue, exile, calling, resistance, deliverance, covenant, rebellion, intercession, failure, and faithfulness. Moses' journey ended on Mount Nebo, but the covenant moved forward, and the man who once asked, "Who am I?" became the prophet through whom an enslaved people learned who they were. The servant died. The promise did not.